Hello everyone. Tonight, I've prepared a special compilation of trucker tales, all gathered into one soothing episode for you to enjoy. Take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It really helps support the channel. Now, let's begin. The Storm Runners, from Marcus Chen. The first time I saw the convoy, I thought it was just another group of drivers trying to outrun the storm that had been chasing me across 3 states. Lightning split the sky behind my Kenworth's mirrors, and the radio crackled with warnings about tornadoes touching down near the Oklahoma border. I'd been driving for 16 years, hauling everything from furniture to frozen goods, but I'd never seen a storm system move with such deliberate purpose, as if it had somewhere specific to be. The convoy appeared just as the rain began hammering my windshield, in sheets so thick my wipers could barely keep up. 7 trucks, all of them pristine white Peterbilts with chrome that somehow gleamed despite the darkness, rolling in perfect formation down Interstate 40. They materialized from the storm like ghosts emerging from fog, their headlights cutting through the deluge with an almost supernatural brilliance. What struck me immediately was how they moved together, maintaining exactly the same speed, the same distance between each rig, as if connected by invisible cables. I was running behind schedule, my load of electronics destined for Little Rock, and the storm was forcing me to crawl along at barely 50 miles per hour. When the convoy pulled alongside me, matching my reduced speed exactly, I felt a strange mix of relief and unease. Relief because other drivers meant safety, meant I wasn't alone in this nightmare weather. Unease because something about their synchronized movement felt wrong, like watching a flock of mechanical birds following some alien migration pattern. The CB radio in my cab had been quiet for miles, unusual for a stretch of highway that normally buzzed with chatter. I reached for the handset and keyed up channel 19, breaker 19. This is the Midnight Express running eastbound, looking for a copy from that white convoy. Static answered me, the kind of deep rolling static that sounds almost like breathing. I tried again. White Peterbilt's running formation. You got your ears on? Nothing but that strange rhythmic static that made the hair on my arm stand up. The storm intensified around us, and I noticed something that made my hands tighten on the steering wheel, while rain hammered my truck from every direction, obscuring my vision and forcing me to lean forward to see the road. The convoy trucks seemed to exist in a pocket of clarity. Water streamed down their windshields in perfect uniform patterns, and their chrome surfaces reflected the lightning with mirror-like precision. It was as if the storm was avoiding them, or they were somehow immune to its chaos. Mile after mile, we drove together through the tempest. The convoy never varied its formation, never broke rank, never showed any sign that human beings were actually controlling those pristine white rigs. I began to feel drowsy despite my growing anxiety, lulled by the steady rhythm of their presence and the hypnotic flash of their synchronized turn signals whenever the highway curved. The storm seemed to be moving with us now, keeping pace, wrapping around our small procession like a living thing. It was near midnight when I first glimpsed the drivers, and that's when my drowsiness vanished like smoke. Lightning flickered across the sky in rapid succession, strobing like a broken fluorescent bulb, and in those brief moments of illumination, I could see into the cabs of the trucks running parallel to me. The drivers sat perfectly upright, hands positioned at exactly 10 and 2 on their steering wheels, heads facing straight ahead. They never moved, not once. No adjusting their mirrors, no reaching for coffee, no scratching their necks or rolling their shoulders. They sat like mannequins, and in the lightning's harsh glare, their skin had a waxy, translucent quality that made my stomach clench. I grabbed my CB again, this time switching to channel 17, then 21, then back to 19. Mayday, mayday. This is Midnight Express on Interstate 40 eastbound, requesting assistance. My voice cracked slightly, and I cleared my throat, trying to maintain some semblance of professional calm. The static that came back sounded different now, like whispers just below the threshold of understanding, as if dozens of voices were trying to speak through the interference at once. The convoy began to change formation. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the trucks started to encircle my Kenworth. 2 moved ahead of me, maintaining their perfect speed and spacing. 2 dropped back to flank my rear. 3 remained alongside, boxing me in with the geometric precision of a military maneuver. They were herding me, guiding me somewhere, and when I tried to slow down, they slowed with me. When I attempted to speed up, they matched my acceleration exactly, maintaining their formation with mechanical perfection. The storm was keeping pace too, and I realized with growing horror that the three of us were connected somehow. The convoy, the storm, and now me, all moving together across the dark landscape like pieces of some cosmic puzzle. The rain fell in patterns that seemed almost intentional, and the lightning struck with rhythm rather than randomness. Thunder rolled across the sky in long, sustained notes that reminded me of whale songs, deep and mournful, and utterly alien. My fuel gauge showed 3/4 full when the convoy first appeared. Now, impossibly, it read nearly empty, though we'd only traveled perhaps 60 miles. The engine temperature was climbing too, despite the cool rain, and my cab was growing warm with a humid heat that smelled of ozone, and something else, something organic and unpleasant, like flowers left too long in stagnant water. The highway ahead began to curve, and I realized I no longer recognized the landscape. This stretch of Interstate 40 should have been familiar, but the rolling hills and scattered farmhouses had given way to something else entirely. Twisted trees lined the road like arthritic fingers, their branches reaching toward the pavement with unnatural geometry. The few buildings I could glimpse in the lightning looked wrong too, their windows too large, their roof lines bent at angles that hurt to look at directly. That's when I saw the exit sign, illuminated by the convoy's synchronized headlights. It was old and weathered, the kind of green highway sign that had been used decades ago, but the words on it shifted and changed each time lightning lit the sky. First it read Storm's End 1 mile, then Last Chance 1 mile, then something in a language I didn't recognize, symbols that seemed to writhe and rearrange themselves like living things. The convoy began signaling for the exit in perfect unison, their turn signals flashing like a synchronized light show. They were taking me somewhere specific, somewhere planned, and every instinct I'd developed in 16 years of long-haul driving screamed at me to break free, to run, to do anything except follow those pristine white trucks down the off-ramp that led into darkness deeper than the storm. I yanked my steering wheel hard to the left, stamping on the accelerator and pulling into the passing lane with a burst of speed that made my engine roar. For a moment I thought I'd broken free. The convoy fell behind, their formation scattered by my sudden maneuver, but the storm followed me, intensifying with each mile I put between myself and those silent white trucks. Rain hammered my windshield with increasing fury, and wind buffeted my trailer so violently that I had to fight to keep the rig on the road. The fuel gauge dropped to empty with frightening speed, and my engine began to sputter and cough. I was losing power, dying by degrees, and in my mirrors I could see headlights approaching through the storm. 7 sets of perfectly aligned lights, gaining on me with inexorable patience, drawing closer with each flash of lightning. I managed to coast into a truck stop just as my engine died completely, rolling into a parking space under flickering sodium lights that cast everything in sickly yellow tones. The place looked abandoned, its windows dark and its fuel pumps covered with plastic bags. But it was shelter, and it was away from the highway where those white trucks prowled like mechanical wolves. The storm passed within minutes of my arrival, the rain tapering off to a gentle drizzle, the wind dying to a whisper. I sat in my dark cab, engine cooling with small metallic ticks, and watched the highway through gaps in the curtains. The convoy never appeared. The road remained empty, innocent, just another stretch of Interstate 40 under clearing skies. When morning came, I managed to get my truck started and limped to the nearest service station. The mechanic found nothing wrong with my fuel system, couldn't explain why my tank had emptied so quickly, or my engine had overheated in cool weather. The CB radio worked perfectly, crackling with normal trucker chatter. Everything seemed normal, rational, explainable, but I still drive that stretch of highway sometimes, usually when weather reports predict severe storms. I watch the sky and listen to my radio, waiting for that familiar pattern of static that sounds like breathing. Because somewhere out there 7 white Peterbilts are running in perfect formation, and they're still looking for drivers to join their eternal convoy through storms that never end. The signal between worlds. From Marcus Holloway. The static had been my only companion for 3 hours straight when I first heard the pulse buried beneath the white noise. Highway 287 stretched endlessly through the Nevada desert, my 18-wheeler cutting through the darkness like a steel whale navigating an ocean of sagebrush and sand. The radio scanner mounted above my CB had been cycling through dead frequencies all night, picking up nothing but the electronic whispers of empty airwaves. But there it was again, faint but rhythmic, like a heartbeat trapped inside the static. I'd been running freight between Reno and Phoenix for the better part of 15 years, and these long stretches of desert highway had become as familiar as my own pulse. The hum of my Peterbilt's engine provided a steady bass note against the whisper of wind across the cab, and usually I'd have some talk radio or trucker chatter to keep the loneliness at bay. Tonight was different though. Every station seemed to fade in and out like dying memories, leaving me with nothing but that strange rhythmic pulse threading through the electronic snow. The dashboard clock read 2:47 a.m. when I decided to pull over at a truck stop I'd never noticed before. The neon sign flickered weakly against the star-drunk sky, casting intermittent pink and blue shadows across the cracked asphalt. Desert Wind Travel Plaza, the sign read, though half the letters buzzed and stuttered like they were fighting to stay alive. I'd driven this route countless times and could have sworn this place had never been here before, but desert highways had a way of revealing hidden pockets of civilization when you least expected them. The pulse in my radio grew stronger as I rolled to a stop, the static seeming to organize itself around that steady rhythm. I left the engine idling and climbed down from the cab, my boots crunching on gravel that seemed too white under the struggling neon lights. The Travel Plaza looked like something from the 70s that had been abandoned and then half-heartedly reopened. Rust stains bled down the walls like tears, and the plate glass windows reflected the night sky in fractured patterns that made my eyes water. Inside, fluorescent tubes flickered overhead with the same irregular pulse I'd been hearing on the radio. The connection sent a chill down my spine that had nothing to do with the desert's nighttime cold. Behind the counter sat a woman who might have been 30 or 60, her features somehow soft and indistinct in the stuttering light. She looked up when I entered, and her smile held the same tired quality as the neon outside. I bought coffee that tasted like it had been brewing since the Carter administration and asked about the radio interference. The clerk's eyes grew distant when I mentioned the pulse, and she glanced toward a door marked "Employees Only" with a kind of nervous recognition. She told me that truckers had been complaining about strange signals for months now, always when they stopped here, always in the deep hours of morning when the world felt thin and uncertain. Back in my cab, I tried switching to different frequencies, but the pulse followed me from station to station like a loyal pet. It was definitely stronger here, more distinct, and as I listened more carefully, I began to make out subtle variations in the rhythm. Sometimes it would speed up for several beats, then slow down again, like something breathing heavy and then catching its breath. The sound quality was wrong too, somehow too organic for electronic interference. It reminded me of the way my ex-wife's heart monitor had sounded during her last weeks in the hospital, that steady beeping that became the soundtrack to waiting and watching and hoping. I should have just fired up the engine and rolled back onto the highway, but something kept me sitting there in the flickering glow of the Travel Plaza sign. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was the way the pulse seemed almost familiar, like a song you can't quite remember, but know you've heard before. I started adjusting the scanner's frequency dial more carefully, trying to isolate the signal and find its source. What I discovered made the coffee in my stomach turn cold. The pulse wasn't coming from any single frequency. It was broadcast across dozens of channels simultaneously, from CB radio up through emergency services, and even into aircraft communication. Whoever or whatever was transmitting had access to equipment that could blanket the entire spectrum with this rhythmic signal. But that wasn't the disturbing part. The disturbing part was that each frequency carried the pulse at slightly different intervals, creating a complex polyrhythm that suggested intelligence, purpose, maybe even communication. I grabbed my logbook and started writing down the patterns, timing the intervals between pulses on different channels. After 20 minutes of careful notation, a picture began to emerge. The pulses weren't random at all. They were following mathematical sequences, prime numbers on some frequencies, Fibonacci progressions on others. Someone was using dead radio channels to broadcast incredibly sophisticated data, disguised as electronic interference that most people would ignore or dismiss as equipment malfunction. The realization hit me just as the travel plaza's neon sign gave one final flicker and went dark. This wasn't just someone broadcasting mathematical curiosities into the night. The patterns were too complex, too layered with meaning. It was a language, and I had stumbled into the middle of a conversation between entities that existed somewhere in the spaces between radio frequencies, using dead channels like neurons in some vast electronic brain. Part of me knew I should just drive away and pretend I'd never heard that pulse, never worked out its hidden complexities. But another part of me, the part that had always been drawn to mysteries and empty highways, and the strange magic that lived in liminal spaces, needed to know more. I keyed the microphone and transmitted on the clearest frequency, sending out my own simple pattern of pulses, a mathematical greeting that any intelligence monitoring these channels would recognize. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Every frequency on my scanner erupted with pulse patterns so complex and rapid that they merged into a sound like mechanical screaming. The truck's electrical system began to fluctuate, dashboard lights dimming and brightening in rhythm with the radio chaos. Through the windshield, I could see similar electrical disturbances rippling across the travel plaza, the dead neon signs sputtering back to life in colors that shouldn't exist, casting shadows that moved independently of any light source. I killed the radio and threw the truck into gear, hoping to outrun whatever attention I had attracted. But as I pulled back onto Highway 287, I realized the pulses were following me. They emerged from my CB radio, my cellular phone, even the truck's GPS system. The entities living in the dead channels had locked onto my electronic signature, and now they knew exactly where I was. Every device in my cab became a conduit for those alien pulse patterns, creating a symphony of communication that my human brain could only partially decode. I caught fragments of meaning in the chaos, glimpses of conversations about harvests and preparations and the thin times when barriers grew weak. Whatever lived in the static was planning something, and my accidental contact had somehow marked me as either a threat or an opportunity. I made it to Phoenix as the sun rose, parking at the first truck stop I could find, and shutting down every electronic device I owned. But even in the silence I could feel them watching, patient and alien, from every dead channel that surrounded me. The static was full of eyes now, and I knew with absolute certainty that I would never again drive through the desert without hearing that pulse, that electronic heartbeat of something vast and hungry that had learned to speak in frequencies between the spaces of our world. The freight company's dispatch radio crackled to life as I sat there in the morning sun, and beneath the dispatcher's familiar voice, I could hear it again, the pulse, waiting, following, learning the rhythm of my own frightened heart, the screams behind the rig. For Marcus Holloway, 37 years I've been hauling freight across these endless highways, and I've learned to trust the rhythm of the road, the steady thrum of diesel engines, the whisper of tires against asphalt, the gentle sway of a properly balanced load. These sounds become your lullabies when you spend more nights in your cab than in your own bed. But sometimes, late at night when the world shrinks down to just your headlights cutting through darkness, you hear things that don't belong to any rhythm you know. I was pulling a refrigerated trailer loaded with produce from California's Central Valley, bound for a distribution center outside Chicago. The weather had turned nasty somewhere past Flagstaff, with rain coming down in sheets that made my windshield wipers work overtime. The interstate stretched out before me like a black river, broken only by the occasional sweep of oncoming headlights and the red glow of taillights disappearing into the murky distance. My Pete 379 hummed along contentedly at 65, her chrome stacks throwing twin columns of heat shimmer into the night air. Despite the rain, she was a good truck, reliable as sunrise, and in weather like this I was grateful for her steady presence. The CB crackled occasionally with chatter from other drivers, complaints about the weather and updates on road conditions ahead. Mostly though it was just me and the storm, the way I liked it, That's when I first noticed the screaming. At first I thought it was just wind noise. October storms can be fierce in this part of the country, and sometimes the wind catches your trailer just right and makes all sorts of strange sounds. But as I listened more carefully, adjusting my side mirrors and checking my gauges, I realized the sound wasn't coming from outside the truck. It seemed to be coming from somewhere behind me, muffled but persistent, like voices calling out from a great distance. I reached for the CB handset and tried raising some of the other drivers I'd been hearing. Breaker 19. This is Freight Dog eastbound at mile marker 247. Anybody else hearing something strange out here tonight? Static answered me, punctuated by the rhythmic sweep of my wipers. I tried again, but the airwaves had gone quiet except for the occasional burst of atmospheric interference. The screams continued, rising and falling with a cadence that seemed almost musical. I found myself listening for patterns, trying to make sense of what I was hearing. Sometimes it sounded like children calling out during a playground game. Other times it had the desperate edge of people in genuine distress. But always it remained just distant enough, just unclear enough, that I couldn't be certain of what I was actually hearing. I pulled into a truck stop outside Gallup just after midnight, hoping a break from the road might clear my head. The parking lot was nearly full despite the hour. Rows of big rigs lined up like sleeping giants in the sodium vapor lighting. I backed into a space between a blue Kenworth and a faded red Freightliner, killed my engine, and stepped out into the rain to do my mandatory walk-around inspection. Everything looked normal. My trailer doors were secure, seals intact. The refrigeration unit hummed quietly, maintaining its steady 34 degrees. I checked my mud flaps, examined my tires, tested my lights. Nothing out of place, nothing that might explain the sounds I'd been hearing. But as I stood there in the rain, water dripping from the brim of my ball cap, I could still hear them, fainter now, but definitely still there, seeming to echo from the space between the parked trucks. Inside the truck stop, fluorescent lights buzzed overhead while a handful of drivers nursed coffee and picked at late-night meals. I bought myself a cup of black coffee and a ham sandwich, then found an empty booth near the window where I could keep an eye on my rig. The coffee was bitter and too hot, but it felt good going down, helping to chase away the chill that had settled into my bones. An older driver at the next table caught my attention when he looked up from his logbook. He had the weathered face of someone who'd been running these roads since before electronic logs and satellite tracking, deep lines carved by wind and sun, and countless nights just like this one. "Rough night out there," he said, nodding toward the rain-streaked windows. "That it is," I replied. "You wouldn't happen to have heard anything strange on your radio tonight, would you? Voices, maybe people calling for help?" His expression shifted slightly, becoming more guarded. "What kind of voices?" I described what I'd been hearing, the distant screaming that seemed to follow me down the highway. As I talked, I watched his weathered hands tighten around his coffee cup, saw something that might have been recognition flicker across his features. "How long you been running this road?" he asked when I finished. "About 15 years, on and off." "Why?" He was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the parking lot, where rain continued to drum against the windshields of sleeping trucks. "There was an accident on this stretch of highway," he finally said. "Must be going on 20 years ago now. School bus got caught in a storm like this one. Driver lost control. Went off the road about 10 miles east of here." The coffee suddenly tasted more bitter. "How many kids?" 36, he said quietly. "Took the rescue crews most of the night to find them all. Some of them were thrown clear when the bus rolled. Ended up scattered across the desert. They say you could hear them calling out in the darkness for hours before help arrived." I felt something cold settle in my stomach that had nothing to do with the weather. "They all make," he shook his head slowly. "Most of them, but not all." I finished my coffee in silence and headed back to my truck. The rain had lessened to a steady drizzle, but the air still felt heavy with moisture and electricity. As I climbed back into my cab and fired up the engine, I tried to push the old driver's story to the back of my mind. Accidents happen on these highways every day. Tragic stories are as common as mile markers. That doesn't mean every strange sound you hear is connected to something supernatural. But as I pulled back onto the interstate and settled into my cruising speed, the screams returned. They seemed louder now, more urgent, as if my brief stop had somehow tuned me in more clearly to whatever frequency they were broadcasting on. I tried turning up my radio, letting the steady rhythm of classic country music drown them out, but they seemed to cut right through the steel guitar and fiddle, persistent as smoke. Mile by mile the sounds grew more distinct. I began to make out individual voices, high and frightened, calling out words I couldn't quite understand. Sometimes they seemed to be coming from directly behind my trailer, as if people were running along in my wake, trying to catch up. Other times they sounded like they were coming from the sides, from the darkness beyond my headlight beams. There was nothing to mark it now. No memorial cross, no flowers, just a slight depression in the desert where the bus had come to rest all those years ago. But as my headlights swept across the area, the screams reached a crescendo that made me grip the steering wheel tighter and press my foot down harder on the accelerator. That's when I saw them in my mirror. At first they were just shapes moving in the darkness behind my trailer, indistinct forms that might have been tricks of light and shadow. But as I watched, they became clearer, children running along the highway, their clothes torn and muddy, their faces pale in the reflection of my taillight. They ran with desperate urgency, their mouths open in silent screams that somehow I could hear clearly despite the distance and the sound of my engine. Some of them came running from the sides, emerging from the desert scrub to join the group following my trail. Others were already there, as if they'd been running behind me all along, waiting for me to notice them. They moved with the peculiar floating gait of people in dreams, their feet not quite touching the asphalt, their arms reaching out toward my truck as if it represented some kind of salvation. I pressed harder on the accelerator, watching my speedometer climb past 70, then 75. But no matter how fast I went, they kept pace effortlessly, their desperate faces always the same distance behind me, in the mirrors. Some of them looked to be about 10 years old, others might have been teenagers. All of them wore the same expression of urgent need, as if they were trying to tell me something important, but couldn't make themselves heard over the sound of wind and engine noise. The CB suddenly crackled to life with a voice I didn't recognize, young and frightened. "Please," it said. "Please, stop. We need help. We've been trying to get home for so long." Yes, I grabbed the handset. A mile marker written in bones, from Jake Morrison. The headlights of my Peterbilt cut through the Nevada desert night like twin searchlights probing the darkness ahead, illuminating nothing but endless asphalt and the occasional tumble of sagebrush dancing across the highway in the autumn wind. I'd been driving this route between Reno and Las Vegas for the better part of 15 years, hauling everything from computer parts to casino supplies, and I knew every curve, every rise, every mile marker between the two cities, like the lines on my weathered hands. The CB radio crackled occasionally with distant chatter from other drivers, their voices offering brief comfort against the vast emptiness that stretched in all directions beyond my windshield. The digital clock on my dashboard glowed a soft green, reading 2:37 in the morning, as I maintained a steady 70 miles per hour through the high desert. My cargo of restaurant equipment for a new casino was secured tight in the trailer behind me, the weight distribution perfect, making the rig handle like a dream, despite the crosswinds that occasionally buffeted the cab. The heater hummed quietly, keeping the October chill at bay while classic rock played softly from my radio, the familiar melodies helping to keep my eyes focused and my mind alert during what should have been just another routine overnight haul. I'd been making good time until I noticed something peculiar about the mile markers along this stretch of highway. At first it was just a nagging feeling that something wasn't quite right, the kind of subtle wrongness that experienced drivers learn to trust after years of reading the road. The reflective green signs that marked each mile of progress toward my destination seemed different somehow, though I couldn't immediately pinpoint what had changed. The moonlight was bright enough that I could make out the desert landscape beyond the guardrails, revealing the familiar scattered Joshua trees and rocky outcroppings that dotted this particular section of highway. As I approached what should have been mile marker 215, my headlights illuminated the familiar rectangular sign, but something about its surface made me ease off the accelerator and lean forward in my seat. Instead of the usual white numbers painted on green metal, the marker appeared to display symbols that looked almost organic in nature, as if they had been carefully arranged rather than printed. The engine of my Peterbilt settled into a lower rumble as I reduced my speed, trying to get a better look at what my eyes were telling me couldn't possibly be real. The symbols on the sign looked exactly like small bones, pale and seemingly ancient, arranged to form numbers in a way that made my skin crawl with unease. From my elevated position in the cab, I could see that they appeared to be actual skeletal remains, though logic told me that was impossible. Mile markers were maintained by the State Highway Department, standardized and regularly inspected, not decorated with what looked like the tiny bones of desert animals arranged in deliberate patterns. I shook my head and pressed the accelerator again, chalking up the unsettling sight to fatigue and the play of shadows in my headlight beams. But the next mile marker displayed the same horrifying characteristic, and the one after that, each sign featuring numbers formed from what appeared to be an intricate arrangement of small bones, bleached white by the desert sun and somehow adhered to the metal surface. The steady rhythm of my diesel engine seemed to grow quieter as I passed each marker, as if the very air around these signs absorbed sound in a way that defied explanation. I reached for my CB radio and keyed the microphone, hoping to raise another driver who might be traveling this same stretch of highway. Breaker 19, this is Desert Phantom eastbound on 95. Anybody else seeing anything strange about the mile markers out here tonight? My voice sounded smaller than usual in the confines of the cab, and the static that answered me held an odd quality, almost like whispered voices speaking just below the threshold of comprehension. I tried again, adjusting the squelch and checking different channels, but received only that same unsettling static that seemed to carry traces of conversation from somewhere far away. The mile markers continued their ghastly display as I pressed onward, each one featuring those carefully arranged bone formations that spelled out the progression of miles in a script that seemed both ancient and deeply wrong. My hands gripped the steering wheel more tightly as I noticed that the bones appeared to be getting larger with each passing sign, progressing from what looked like the tiny skeletons of insects and small rodents to the unmistakable rib cages and limb bones of desert rabbits and prairie dogs. The desert around me seemed to grow more desolate with each passing mile, as if the presence of these altered markers was somehow draining life from the landscape itself. As I approached mile marker 223, my headlights revealed something that made me tap the brake pedal hard enough to engage the air brakes with a sharp hiss. The bones forming the numbers on this sign were unmistakably larger, clearly mammalian, and arranged with such precision that they could only have been placed by human hand. But more disturbing than their size was the fact that some of them appeared to be moving slightly in the desert wind, creating subtle shifts in the numerical display that made the mile marker seem almost alive in the dancing beam of my headlight. I brought the rig to a complete stop on the shoulder of the highway, the hazard lights casting an orange glow across the cab interior as I stared at the impossible sight before me. The bones that formed the number 223 were definitely shifting, rearranging themselves into different configurations as I watched, spelling out numbers that climbed steadily higher despite the fact that I wasn't moving. 224, 225, 226. The skeletal digits reformed themselves with deliberate purpose, as if counting down or perhaps counting up toward some predetermined destination. The engine of my Peterbilt idled with its familiar rumble, but even that comforting sound seemed muted and distant as I witnessed the mile marker continue its impossible transformation. The bones moved with a fluid grace that suggested they were being manipulated by invisible hands, each element sliding into place with the precision of a master craftsman assembling a delicate puzzle. I rubbed my eyes and looked again, hoping that fatigue was playing tricks on my perception, but the display continued its relentless numerical progression. When the bones rearranged themselves to display 230, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October night air seeping through the weather seals around my window. 230 was exactly the mile marker where I always stopped at the Desert Rose truck stop for fuel and a quick meal break, a landmark I had been anticipating for the past hour of driving. But according to my odometer and my intimate knowledge of this route, that truck stop was still 7 miles ahead, not visible from my current position on this empty stretch of highway. As if summoned by the bone marker's display, lights began to appear in the distance ahead, the familiar neon glow of a truck stop rising from the desert floor like a mirage made real. But this wasn't the desert rose I knew so well, with its modern LED signs and well-maintained facilities. The lights ahead flickered with the unsteady glow of old neon tubing, casting colors that seemed somehow wrong, too bright and too pale, like the luminescence of deep-sea creatures or the cold fire of marsh gases. I released the brake and allowed the rig to roll forward slowly, approaching the impossible truck stop with growing trepidation. The bone mile marker beside me continued its numerical dance, now displaying numbers far higher than should exist on this particular stretch of highway, as if I had somehow been transported to a different road entirely. The CB radio crackled with increasing activity, voices that sounded like they came from decades past, discussing routes and destinations that I had never heard mentioned in all my years of long-haul driving. The truck stop grew larger as I approached, revealing details that filled me with mounting dread. The pumps were ancient models that I hadn't seen since my childhood, and the few vehicles parked in the lot appeared to be trucks from the 1970s and 80s, their chrome bumpers and square headlights reflecting the eerie neon in patterns that hurt my eyes to look at direct. The building itself seemed to shift and waver slightly, as if it existed only partially in the same reality as the highway beneath my wheels. I knew I should turn around, should flee this impossible place and the bone markers that had somehow led me here. But my fuel gauge showed less than a quarter tank remaining, and the next real truck stop was more than 50 miles ahead. The engine of my Peterbilt seemed to make the decision for me, sputtering slightly as if it too sensed the wrongness of this place, but lacked the power to resist its pull. I guided the rig toward the fuel island, my hands trembling slightly on the steering wheel, as I prepared to discover what kind of attendant worked at a truck stop that existed outside the normal flow of highway miles. As I shut down the engine and reached for the door handle, I caught one last glimpse of the bone mile marker in my side mirror, watching as the skeletal digits rearranged themselves one final time to display a number so high that it couldn't possibly exist. The map that knows your name. From Marcus A. The GPS unit came with the rig when I bought it off a lot in Bakersfield, one of those older Garmin models with a cracked screen that the previous owner had left mounted on the dashboard. I figured it was worthless, but trucking expenses add up fast, so I kept it as a backup to my phone's navigation. For 6 months it sat there collecting dust and sunlight, its blank screen reflecting the endless miles of interstate that rolled past my windshield. The night everything changed started like any other. I was hauling furniture from Phoenix to Seattle, running behind schedule because of construction delays outside Flagstaff. The October air had that crisp bite that made me grateful for my Peterbilt's reliable heater, and the radio was playing some late-night talk show about UFO sightings in the desert. My phone's battery had died somewhere near the Nevada border, and with my charger fried from a truck stop mishap, I was navigating by highway signs and muscle memory. The screen flickered to life with a soft blue glow that seemed unusually bright in the cab's dim interior. The startup chime played a melody I didn't recognize, something almost musical, like wind chimes in a gentle breeze. Instead of the usual welcome message, text appeared that made me blink twice to make sure I was reading it correctly. Hello Marcus, ready to find your way? The previous owner had been a guy named Rodriguez, according to the paperwork. There was no reason for this device to know who I was, yet there it sat, waiting patiently for my response as if we were old friends. I chalked it up to some kind of Bluetooth connection with my dead phone, maybe picking up old data somehow. Technology always found ways to surprise me, usually at the worst possible moments. I needed directions, and here was a GPS offering them. The practical side of my brain overruled the uneasy feeling in my stomach. Navigate to Seattle, I said, figuring it might have voice recognition. The screen immediately displayed a rig, but not the one I expected. Instead of keeping me on I-84 through Oregon like every other navigation system would, it showed a path that curved east through Idaho, up into Montana, then west through some of the most remote highways in Washington. The rate was highlighted in a pale green that pulsed gently like a heartbeat. Estimated arrival time 6:47 a.m. appeared at the bottom. This rate offers better scenery for someone who appreciates solitude. Marcus, a better scenery. The GPS was making subjective judgments about my preferences. I stared at the screen, watching that green line pulse, and felt the first real chill of unease crawl up my spine. The sensible thing would have been to turn it off and stick to the main highways. But I was curious now, and if I was being honest, there was something appealing about the idea of avoiding the heavy traffic corridors, even if it meant a longer drive. The road was well maintained but empty, the kind of rate that truckers sometimes use to avoid way stations or congested areas. My headlights carved through the night, illuminating mile markers and reflective signs that seemed to appear just when I needed them. For the first hour, everything seemed normal. The GPS provided standard turn-by-turn directions in a pleasant female voice that I didn't remember from any Garmin system I'd used before. She had a slight accent I couldn't place, something that made her words sound like they were coming from far away, perhaps through a tunnel or across water. In 2 miles, merge left onto State Route 78, she said, her voice mixing with the steady hum of my engine. You're making good time, Marcus. The night is treating you well. Personal observations again. GPS units don't comment on how the night is treating you. They give distances and directions. Nothing more. But her voice was soothing, almost hypnotic, and I found myself relaxing into the rhythm of the drive. The highway stretched ahead like a gray ribbon, empty of other traffic, lit only by a half moon that painted everything in silver and shadow. The rate took me through country I'd never seen before, past small towns that appeared as clusters of distant lights in the darkness. According to the GPS, these places had names like Mill Haven and Cross Creek, communities so small they didn't appear on most maps. The device seemed to know them intimately, though, commenting on local landmarks as we passed. To your right you'll see Miller's Orchard, the voice said as I drove past what looked like endless rows of bare trees. They grow the sweetest apples in the county, Mark. Your sister would have loved them. My hands tightened on the steering wheel. My sister Sarah had died in a car accident 3 years ago. She'd loved apples, used to pick them every fall at an orchard near our childhood home in Ohio. There was no way a GPS unit could know about her, let alone her preferences. No way at all. They pulled over at the next wide spot in the road and grabbed the device, examining it closely under the cab's interior light. It was definitely a standard Garmin unit, probably 5 or 6 years old, with the usual ports and buttons. The model number was worn away, but everything else looked completely ordinary. When I turned it over, though, I found something that made my breath catch. Scratched into the plastic back, barely visible unless you held it at just the right angle, was a name, property of M. Henley, Marcus Henley. My full name. My mind raced through possibilities. The previous owner, Rodriguez, could have looked up my information somehow, programmed this as some kind of elaborate prank. But Rodriguez had seemed like a straightforward guy, desperate to sell his rig and get out of trucking altogether. He'd mentioned health problems, a desire to spend more time with his grandchildren, not the type for complicated practical jokes. I set the GPS back in its mount and stared at the screen. The route was still displayed, that pulsing green line leading deeper into the mountain country. A new message had appeared while I'd been examining the device. Don't worry, Marcus. Trust the journey. You'll understand soon. Every instinct I'd developed in 20 years of long-haul trucking told me to turn around, get back to the main highway, forget about this malfunctioning piece of electronics. But something stronger than instinct was pulling me forward. Curiosity, maybe, or the kind of stubborn determination that had kept me driving through blizzards and breakdowns. I needed to know what this was about. The GPS continued its commentary, pointing out details about the landscape that I couldn't see in the darkness, but somehow knew were accurate. It told me about a Civil War memorial in a town we bypassed, about a lake where a local legend claimed a monster lived, about a bridge where a famous photograph had been taken decades ago. And mixed in with these observations were personal comments that cut deeper each time. The sunrise ahead will remind you of the morning you decided to become a trucker, Marcus. You were 22, standing in your father's garage, looking at that old Ford he was rebuilding. She was right. Dad had been working on a 1967 Ford pickup, baby blue with chrome bumpers. I'd stood there that morning, coffee mug in hand, watching him adjust the carburetor, and suddenly knew I wanted to spend my life on the road. The decision had felt as natural as breathing. He always worried you'd get restless, settle for something ordinary. Dad had died 5 years ago. I'd never told anyone about that morning, in the garage, about the moment I'd chosen this life. The memory was private, personal, important only to me. The road began climbing into mountains, winding through forests that pressed close on both sides. My headlights caught glimpses of deer watching from the tree line, their eyes reflecting like stars before they melted back into the darkness. The GPS's voice had become softer, more intimate, as if she were sitting beside me instead of speaking through tiny speakers. Almost there, Marcus. Just a few more miles. Almost where? I asked aloud, though I didn't expect an answer. Home, she replied immediately. The place you've been looking for without knowing you were searching. The road crested a hill, and suddenly the forest opened into a wide valley. Below me, nestled between rolling slopes and a meandering river, lay a town that glowed with warm yellow light. It looked like something from a postcard, complete with a church steeple and tree-lined streets. Exit 127. The road that remembers. See, from Marcus Chen. 23 years, hauling freight cross-country. Teaches you that your mind can play tricks on you when you're pushing through the dark hours between midnight and dawn, especially on routes you've driven so many times they blur together like old photographs left too long in sunlight. But this particular stretch of Interstate 40 through eastern Arizona had always been as predictable as clockwork, with its familiar constellation of exits marking gas stations, truck stops, and forgotten desert towns that exist mainly as dots on outdated maps. I'd been running this Phoenix to Albuquerque route twice weekly for the better part of a decade, hauling everything from electronics to produce in my 20s. The truck's engine hummed its familiar diesel lullaby as I cruised through the pre-dawn darkness, my headlights cutting through the desert air that still held the day's lingering heat even at 3 in the morning. The radio played soft country music, turned low, just loud enough to keep me company, without drowning out the hypnotic rhythm of tires on asphalt that had become the soundtrack to my life. Just another numbered off-ramp, leading to a cluster of basic services, a small truck stop with decent coffee and clean restrooms, a family-owned diner that served surprisingly good pie, and a gas station that stayed open all night for drivers like me, who lived between time zones. The green highway sign would appear in my headlights exactly 17 miles past the previous exit, announcing services, food, fuel, in the standard white lettering that highway departments use everywhere. I'd taken that exit hundreds of times over the years, sometimes for fuel, sometimes just to stretch my legs and grab a cup of coffee before continuing east toward the New Mexico border. But on this particular Tuesday morning in late September, something felt different the moment my headlights illuminated the green sign. Instead of the familiar services, food, fuel designation, the sign now read Historic District, Antiques, Mountain View Lodge. I blinked hard, thinking fatigue was affecting my vision, but the words remained stubbornly unchanged. The exit ramp curved away into darkness just as it always had, but now it seemed to promise something entirely different from the truck stop and diner I'd known for so many years. Curiosity got the better of caution, and I downshifted, feeling the engine brake slow my rig as I took the familiar curve of the exit ramp. But instead of the usual cluster of bright commercial lighting that marked truck stops across America, I found myself driving through what appeared to be a small historic town, complete with Victorian-era buildings their ornate wooden facades illuminated by warm yellow streetlights that gave everything a sepia-toned quality like an old postcard. Antique shops lined both sides of the main street, their windows filled with mysterious shapes and shadows that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. The Mountain View Lodge sat at the end of the street, a grand 3-story building with wraparound porches and gingerbread trim that belonged in a different century. Soft light glowed from its windows, and I could see figures moving about inside, though they seemed somehow insubstantial, like people viewed through thick fog or old glass. I parked my rig in what appeared to be an enlarged parking area behind the lodge, the diesel engine ticking and cooling in the mountain air that had replaced the desert heat I'd been driving through just moments before. The strangest part was how natural it all felt, as if this historic district had always been here, and my memories of the truck stop were somehow false or imposed from outside. I could smell wood smoke and something baking, possibly bread or pastries, carried on a cool breeze that whispered through pine trees that definitely hadn't been growing in the Arizona desert when I'd taken the exit ramp. When I looked back toward the interstate, I could see my truck's taillights reflecting off the entrance ramp, but the desert highway seemed impossibly distant, like something viewed through the wrong end of a telescope. I spent about an hour exploring the town, browsing through antique shops that seemed to be open despite the early hour, staffed by proprietors who smiled and nodded, but whose faces I couldn't quite focus on no matter how hard I tried. The items for sale were fascinating but unsettling, things that seemed familiar yet wrong somehow, like childhood toys redesigned by someone who had only heard them described secondhand. I bought a cup of coffee and a slice of apple pie from a small cafe, both of which tasted exactly like memories of coffee and pie, rather than the actual things themselves. When I returned to my truck and drove back up the entrance ramp, I emerged onto a stretch of Interstate 40 that looked identical to the desert highway I'd been traveling, but the mile markers seemed different, though I couldn't put my finger on exactly how. The radio was playing the same country song I'd been listening to when I took the exit, as if no time had passed at all during my hour-long exploration of the historic district. 2 weeks later, making the same run on another Tuesday morning, I approached exit 107 with a mixture of anticipation and unease. This time, the sign read Recreational Vehicle Park, Swimming, Fish. The exit led to a sprawling RV park, centered around a lake that reflected stars I was certain I'd never seen before in the Arizona sky. The air smelled of night-blooming jasmine and carried the sound of laughter from families enjoying late-night campfires, though when I walked toward the sounds, they always seemed to be coming from just around the next corner or the next hill. Exit 107 became University Campus, Visitor Welcome Center, student housing, leading to a collection of ivy-covered buildings that housed a college that specialized in subjects I'd never heard of, with course catalogs listing classes in applied temporal mechanics and comparative reality studies. Students walked the pathways between buildings, carrying books and backpacks, but their conversations faded to whispers whenever I drew near, and their faces, like those of the antique shop proprietors, remained frustratingly indistinct, no matter how directly I looked at them. Each transformation of Exit 127 felt complete and authentic while I was experiencing it, as if reality was reshaping itself around the off-ramp with each of my visits. But 12 hours later, heading west on my return trip, the exit would be back to its original configuration, just another truck stop and diner, serving coffee and pie to drivers crossing the desert in the early morning hours. The staff at the truck stop never remembered serving me during my visits to the changing versions of their location, but they always greeted me with the kind of professional friendliness that suggested I was a regular customer they were genuinely happy to see. Exit 127 became an art gallery district, a seaside fishing village complete with ocean waves that crashed against cliffs in the middle of the Arizona desert, a winter ski resort where snow fell gently on peaks that materialized from nowhere, and a farming community where wheat fields stretched endlessly under stars that formed constellations I'd never learned the names of. Each version felt equally real while I was experiencing it, but equally impossible when I tried to reconcile them with the geography and physics of the world I thought I knew. The most unsettling aspect wasn't the changes themselves, but the growing certainty that Exit 127 was somehow responding to me personally, creating experiences tailored to needs and desires I hadn't even been aware I possessed. The historic district had appeared during a period when I'd been feeling disconnected from the past and my family's history. The university campus materialized when I'd been wondering what my life might have been like if I'd pursued education instead of immediately starting my trucking career after high school. Now, as I approach Exit 127 on another late-night run through the Arizona desert, I can see the green sign taking shape in my headlights, but I can't yet make out what it promises this time. My hands are steady on the steering wheel, but my heart races with anticipation and a growing dread that maybe eventually I'll take the exit and find exactly what I need most. Something so perfectly suited to fill the empty spaces in my life that I'll never be able to bring myself to drive back up that entrance ramp to continue my journey. The engine hums its familiar song. The radio plays softly in the background, and Exit 127 waits ahead in the darkness, ready to become whatever it needs to be to keep me forever. The tethered light. From Marcus. The moon shouldn't follow you like a loyal dog, but that's exactly what it was doing as I pushed my Peterbilt through the Nevada desert on that October night. I'd been driving long haul for 15 years, seen every kind of sky from the Atlantic to the Pacific, but I'd never noticed the moon moving in perfect sync with my cab until that run from Reno to Phoenix. It started innocent enough, the way these things always do. I was making good time on Highway 95, the desert stretching endlessly on both sides like a sea of black glass under the star-drunk sky. The radio was playing some late-night talk show about UFO sightings, the host's voice a comforting drone against the steady rumble of my diesel engine. My headlights carved a tunnel through the darkness, illuminating nothing but asphalt and the occasional tumbleweed dancing across the road like a ghost trying to hitch a ride. That's when I first really looked up and saw it hanging there, full and bright as a silver dollar somebody had polished to mirror shine. The moon sat perfectly centered in my windshield, riding the horizon like it had been mounted there on purpose. Nothing unusual about that, I thought. Just coincidence, the way sometimes a song on the radio seems written just for your mood, or how you notice a certain kind of car everywhere after you've been thinking about buying one. But as the miles rolled under my wheels and Highway 95 curved and twisted through the desert landscape, that moon never moved from its spot. Not an inch. Every time the road bent left, the moon slid left with it. When the highway straightened and pointed due south, the moon followed along, keeping perfect pace with my 18 wheels like it was magnetized to my hood ornament. I checked my mirror and there it was, still hanging in the exact center of my windshield, bright enough to read by. The radio crackled with static and the UFO show faded into white noise, leaving me alone with the hum of my engine and the whisper of wind around my cab. I reached for the tuning dial, trying to find another station, but every frequency gave me the same thing, empty static punctuated by what sounded almost like breathing. Deep, slow inhales and exhales that matched the rhythm of my own lungs without me realizing it, until I caught myself holding my breath to break the pattern. I've driven through every kind of weather every hour of the day and night, through mountains and plains and coastal highways where the ocean stretches to infinity, but I'd never felt watched before. Not like this. The moon hung there in my windshield like an eye, unblinking and patient, and I started to feel like maybe I wasn't the one doing the driving anymore. Maybe I was being led somewhere, pulled along invisible strings toward a destination I hadn't chosen. The highway stretched ahead, arrow straight for miles, but the moon never wavered from its position. When I leaned left in my seat, it leaned with me. When I adjusted my mirrors or checked my gauges, that silver circle stayed locked in place like it had been painted on the glass. I tried telling myself it was just the perspective, some trick of distance and angle that made it seem like the moon was following me, but I'd been driving long enough to know the difference between ordinary and wrong. My CB radio came to life with a burst of static, then a voice calling out channel checks and asking about road conditions ahead. I grabbed the handset, grateful for human contact, and keyed the mic. The trucker was heading north on 95, he said, running empty back to Reno after a delivery in Vegas. I asked him if he could see the moon from his cab, trying to keep my voice casual, just making conversation to pass the miles. He laughed and said sure, it was hanging right there in front of him, bright as anything, following the road like it was painted on rails. That should have been reassuring, proof that I wasn't losing my mind or seeing things that weren't there. But something in the way he said it, the tone of his voice, made my skin crawl. He sounded dreamy, distant, like he was talking in his sleep. When I asked him his location, he said he'd been driving for hours, but couldn't remember passing any mile markers or towns. I checked my watch and realized I'd been on the road for 6 hours straight, without stopping, but my fuel gauge still showed 3/4 full. The odometer was turning over like normal, eating up the miles, but when I tried to remember the last town I'd passed, or the last exit sign I'd seen, my mind came up empty. Just endless highway and desert, and that moon hanging in my windshield, like a surveillance camera. That's when I noticed my speedometer. The needle was locked at exactly 65 miles per hour, steady as a rock, but I could feel my foot on the accelerator, pressing harder or lighter, depending on the grade of the road. The engine note changed when I pushed the pedal, the turbo spooling up and down, but the speedometer never moved. 65 constant, like I was locked in cruise control. But I knew the cruise wasn't set. I tried the brakes, just a gentle tap to see what would happen, and felt the pedal go soft under my foot, sinking to the floor with no resistance. The truck kept rolling at exactly 65, the moon kept hanging in perfect position, and the highway kept unrolling ahead of me, like a black ribbon with no beginning and no end. I wasn't driving anymore. I was just along for the ride. The desert started to change outside my windows, the landscape shifting in ways that didn't make sense. Rock formations appeared and disappeared like stage props being moved by invisible hands. Joshua trees bent in directions that defied the wind, their twisted arms pointing always toward my cab, following my progress like spectators at a parade. The stars wheeled overhead in patterns I didn't recognize, constellations that seemed to rearrange themselves when I wasn't looking directly at them. If anything, it seemed to be getting larger, growing imperceptibly brighter with each mile that rolled under my wheels. I could see details now that shouldn't have been visible, craters and shadows and what looked almost like structures on its surface. Geometric shapes too regular to be natural formations, arranged in patterns that hurt to look at for too long. My CB radio crackled back to life, and I heard that same trucker's voice calling out again, asking about road conditions, sounding exactly the same as he had hours earlier. The same words, the same inflection, like a recording being played on repeat. When I tried to respond, my own voice came out strange and distant, echoing in the cab, like I was speaking from the bottom of a well. The fuel gauge still read 3/4 full. The speedometer still held at 65, and the moon still hung there like a silver hook drawing me forward. I began to understand that this wasn't a journey anymore. This was something else entirely. A test maybe, or a trap, or just the way things worked in this part of the desert, where the normal rules didn't apply. Real human contact, someone who could break whatever spell had settled over my rig like a net. But as the other truck approached and passed, I caught a glimpse of the driver in my peripheral vision, and the hope died cold in my chest. The driver was same face, same company cap, same worn flannel shirt. He didn't wave or acknowledge me at all, just stared straight ahead at his own tethered moon, hanging in his own windshield. I yanked the wheel hard right, aiming for what looked like a dirt access road, leading away from the highway. The steering wheel spun freely in my hands, offering no resistance, and the truck continued straight down Highway 95 like it was running on rails. The moon pulsed once, twice, brighter than before, and I felt something cold and vast turn its attention toward me with the weight of centuries. But somehow, just as I felt myself slipping away completely, becoming another ghost driver on an endless highway, my right front tire caught the edge of a pothole. The jolt was enough to break the spell for just an instant, and I felt my controls come back to life. I stood on the brakes with everything I had, downshifting frantically, and managed to bring the rig to a shuddering stop on the shoulder. According to my GPS, I was exactly where I should be, 40 miles north of Tonopah, and dawn was starting to paint the horizon pink and gold. My logbook showed I'd been driving for exactly the legal limit. No gaps, no missing time. But I still remember that feeling of being pulled forward by invisible. The gauge that knows. From Marcus. The thing about driving cross-country for 23 years is that you start to notice when something's different about your rig, even the smallest detail that wasn't there before. My Peterbilt 309 and I had been partners for over a decade. Every gauge, every switch, every rattle is familiar to me as my own heartbeat. That's why I knew immediately that the fuel gauge was wrong when I fired her up outside of Bakersfield on that fog-thick October morning. Not wrong in the way you'd expect, mind you. The needle wasn't stuck or jumping around like gauges do when they're dying. No, this was something else entirely. Instead of the usual markings from empty to full, there were words etched into the glass where the fuel levels should be. Words that made my coffee turn cold in my throat as I read them in the amber glow of the dashboard lights. Below that, descending toward empty, the words read fortunate, then uncertain, followed by troubled, and finally, where empty would normally sit at the bottom, a single word that made my hands tighten involuntarily on the steering wheel: doom. The needle pointed steadily at blessed, which should have been reassuring, but something about the whole situation sent a chill crawling up my spine like ice water. I'd filled up not 20 minutes ago, so the gauge should have read full, and technically it did, just not in any way that made sense. I rubbed my eyes, thinking maybe the early morning darkness and too much caffeine were playing tricks on me, but when I looked again, the words remained crisp and clear as if they'd always been there. The logical thing would have been to pull over, pop the hood, maybe call my mechanic Dave back in Fresno, but I had a load of electronics bound for Phoenix, and the delivery window was tight. Besides, the truck was running smooth as silk, purring like she always did when she was happy. The engine hummed its familiar lullaby, the Jake brake responded perfect, and all the other gauges read normal. Just that one gauge had gone strange on me, and I convinced myself it was probably some kind of electrical glitch that I could deal with after I made my delivery. The fog began to lift as I merged onto Interstate 5, and the morning sun painted the Central Valley in shades of gold and amber. For a while I almost forgot about the gauge, lost in the rhythm of the road and the steady thrum of 18 wheels on asphalt. The CB chattered occasionally with other drivers discussing weather conditions and traffic reports, their voices a comforting reminder that I wasn't alone out here in the vastness of California's agricultural heartland. It was somewhere around Button Willow, about 200 miles into my run, when I noticed the needle had moved. Not by much, just a hair's width, but enough that it now pointed between blessed and fortunate. The sight of it made my stomach clench with an anxiety I couldn't explain. I'd been driving long enough that fuel consumption was second nature to me, and I knew my truck should still be reading nearly full. But according to this impossible gauge, something had changed about my circumstances, something that moved me one step closer to whatever doomed might mean. I tried to shake off the growing unease by focusing on the familiar sights along the highway. The endless rows of crops stretching toward distant mountains, the occasional farmhouse with smoke rising from its chimney, the dance of heat mirages already beginning to shimmer despite the early hour. But my eyes kept drifting back to that gauge, watching for any further movement of that needle, dreading what it might mean if it continued to slide downward. The first real sign that something was amiss came as I approached the Grapevine, that notorious stretch of highway that climbs through the mountains separating the Central Valley from Los Angeles. Traffic had slowed to a crawl, unusual for this time of morning, and as I crested a hill, I could see the flashing lights of emergency vehicles ahead. An accident, apparently a bad one, judging by the number of ambulances and fire trucks blocking the right shoulder. As I inched past the wreckage, I saw it was another big rig, a Kenworth much like mine, but this one was twisted and broken, its cab crushed against a concrete barrier with such force that it barely looked like it had once been a truck. The trailer had jackknifed, and was lying on its side across 2 lanes, its contents spilled across the asphalt, like the scattered thoughts of a dying mind. I said a quiet prayer for whoever had been driving, hoping they'd made it out alive, though the condition of the cab made that seem unlikely. That's when I glanced down at my fuel gauge, and felt my blood turn to ice water in my veins. The needle now pointed directly at uncertain, and I realized with a clarity that cut through me like a blade that this gauge wasn't measuring fuel at all. It was measuring something else entirely, something that had everything to do with fate and fortune, and the thin line between making it home safe and becoming another statistic on the highway. I pulled off at the next truck stop, my hands shaking slightly, as I guided the Peterbilt into a parking space away from the other trucks. The gauge still read uncertain, the needle steady and unwavering in its ominous position. I sat there for a long moment, listening to the tick and ping of the cooling engine, trying to process what was happening to me. Part of me wanted to believe this was all some elaborate hallucination brought on by stress and too many energy drinks, but the gauge was as real as the steering wheel in my hand. The truck stop was one of those sprawling places that catered to drivers like me, with showers and a restaurant and a shop full of everything from basic supplies to novelty items. I walked inside, hoping that getting away from the truck might help me think more clearly, but I found myself unable to concentrate on anything except the certainty that I'd left my rig with a gauge that could predict the future, or at least my future, and it wasn't looking particularly bright. I bought a cup of coffee and sat at the counter, staring out the window at my truck and wondering what I should do. Call my dispatcher and tell him I was having mechanical problems. Drive to the nearest dealership and demand they explain how my fuel gauge had turned into some kind of supernatural fortune-telling device. The rational part of my mind insisted there had to be a logical explanation, but the longer I sat there, the more convinced I became that logic had very little to do with what was happening to me. When I finally returned to the truck an hour later, the gauge read troubled, and I knew with a sick certainty that whatever force was at work here wasn't done with me yet. I considered abandoning the run altogether, maybe even abandoning the truck, but 23 years of driving had ingrained certain habits in me that were hard to break. I had a job to finish, a commitment to honor, and despite everything, I couldn't just walk away from that responsibility. The afternoon sun was brutal as I continued southward, the temperature climbing well into the 90s despite the season. The air conditioning worked overtime, and I could feel the engine working harder than usual to maintain speed on the climbing grade. Other drivers on the CB were complaining about the heat and the traffic, their voices tinged with the irritation that comes from spending too many hours in a confined space, while the world bakes around you. As evening approached and the gauge continued its inexorable slide toward doom, I began to notice other things going wrong. Small things at first, a slight vibration in the steering wheel that hadn't been there before, an occasional hiccup in the engine's rhythm, a rattling sound from somewhere behind me that seemed to be getting louder with each passing mile. The truck was developing problems as surely as the gauge was predicting my fate, as if the two were somehow connected in ways that defied explanation. By the time I reached the outskirts of Phoenix, the needle was hovering between troubled and doomed, and my nerves were stretched tight as piano wire. The vibration in the steering wheel had grown more pronounced, and I could smell something burning, though I couldn't identify what it was. Every instinct I'd developed over 2 decades of driving was screaming at me to pull over, to get the truck checked out before something catastrophic happened. But I was so close to my destination that I convinced myself I could make it just a few more miles. The needle touched doomed, just as I was navigating the interchange toward my delivery point, and in that same instant I felt the steering wheel jerk violently to the left. A tire had blown, the right front steer tire, and suddenly I was fighting to control 40 tons of truck and trailer as it tried to veer into oncoming traffic. The world slowed to a crystalline clarity as I wrestled with the wheel, using every technique I'd ever learned about emergency handling to keep the rig upright and moving in something resembling a straight line. The Crimson Mile. From Jake Morrison. The CB radio crackled with static as I guided my Peterbilt down Interstate 80, somewhere between the fading lights of Sacramento and the endless darkness that swallows Nevada whole. 23 years I've been hauling freight across this country, and I thought I'd seen every stretch of asphalt, every painted line, every mile marker that dots America's circulatory system. The dashboard clock read 2:47 a.m., its green glow competing with the soft amber of my running lights as they cut through the October fog that hung like gauze over the Sierra foothill. My cargo tonight was nothing special, just 38,000 pounds of ceramic tiles bound for Reno, but the dispatcher had been insistent about taking this particular route. Highway 80 through the mountains instead of my usual swing south through Bakersfield. Said something about construction delays on the 99, but when I'd checked the DOT website at my last fuel stop, there hadn't been any advisory. Still, Charlie back at the office had never steered me wrong before, and the pay was the same regardless of which ribbon of concrete I chose to follow through the California night. The fog was getting thicker as I climbed toward Donner Pass, that infamous stretch where winter claims its due every year without fail. My headlights barely penetrated 20 feet ahead, turning the world into a tunnel of swirling gray that seemed to close in around my cab like something alive and breathing. The engine hummed its familiar diesel lullaby, a sound that had become as comforting to me as a mother's heartbeat, but tonight even that steady rhythm couldn't shake the unease that had been building in my chest since I'd left the truck stop in Auburn. That's when I first noticed the road paint glowing red. Coffee can only carry you so far before your brain begins manufacturing its own entertainment. But as I rounded a sweeping curve that hugged the mountainside, the center line beneath my truck pulsed with a deep crimson light, as if someone had filled the painted stripe with liquid fire that beckoned me forward through the mist. I eased off the accelerator and leaned forward, my hands tightening on the steering wheel, as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. The yellow lines that marked the shoulder remained their usual reflective white in my headlights, but that center stripe continued to glow with an intensity that seemed to increase as I watched. It wasn't the familiar reflection of my markers or the ghostly luminescence of standard highway paint caught in artificial light. This was something else entirely, something that pulsed with a rhythm all its own, like a vein carrying blood through the mountain's heart. The CB radio hissed and popped, occasional fragments of distant conversations bleeding through the static as other drivers navigated their own corners of the night. I reached for the microphone, meaning to ask if anyone else was seeing what I was seeing on this stretch of 80, but my hand froze halfway to the handset. What would I say? That the road was bleeding light, that the highway department had apparently switched to some kind of supernatural paint that glowed like the fires of hell. Even the most understanding trucker would figure I'd been pushing too hard and needed to find a place to rest. The fog began to thin as I climbed higher, revealing more of the road ahead, and with that clarity came a sight that made my breath catch in my throat. The red glow wasn't limited to just the center line anymore. It had spread to form symbols along the asphalt, strange geometric patterns that stretched across both lanes like some kind of ritualistic marking. They appeared to be painted in the same crimson substance as the center line, but their arrangement was deliberate, purposeful, as if someone had turned this remote stretch of highway into a canvas for something I couldn't begin to understand. My speedometer had dropped to 35 miles per hour without me realizing it, the Peterbilt's engine settling into a lower rumble as I navigated this increasingly surreal landscape. The symbols grew more complex the further I traveled, evolving from simple triangles and circles into intricate designs that seemed to shift and writhe when caught in my peripheral vision. When I looked directly at them, they remained static, just paint on asphalt, but the moment my attention drifted, they appeared to move like living things trapped beneath the surface of the road. The temperature gauge on my dashboard hadn't moved, but I could feel heat radiating up through the floorboards of my cab as if the road itself was warming from some internal source. The familiar smell of diesel and road dust that typically filled my nostrils was being replaced by something else, something that reminded me of hot metal and ozone, the scent that lingers in the air after lightning strikes too close for comfort. That's when I realized I hadn't seen another vehicle in over an hour. Long-haul drivers pushing through to make their delivery windows, late-night commuters heading home from casino losses in Reno, California, highway patrol officers maintaining their vigilant watch over these treacherous mountain passes. But my mirrors showed only darkness, and the road ahead remained empty except for those impossible glowing symbols that seemed to be guiding me towards some unknown destination. I tried the CB radio again, cycling through channels and calling out to any driver who might be within range, but the static had grown more intense, occasionally resolving into sounds that resembled voices, speaking in languages I couldn't identify. The words, if they were words at all, seemed to match the pulsing rhythm of the red paint beneath my wheels, as if the radio was somehow tuning into whatever force was responsible for this midnight light show. The next curve revealed something that made me tap the brake pedal hard enough to feel my load shift against the trailer walls behind me. Ahead, maybe a quarter-mile down the mountain, the red glow had concentrated into what looked like a massive symbol painted across the entire width of the highway. It was circular, filled with interconnected lines and shapes that hurt to look at directly, and it pulsed with such intensity that it painted the surrounding pine trees and granite outcroppings in shades of blood and shadow. Every instinct I'd developed in my years on the road was screaming at me to turn around, to find an off-ramp or an emergency vehicle turnaround, and get the hell away from whatever I'd stumbled into. But even as that logical voice in my head cataloged my growing terror, I felt an almost magnetic pull drawing me forward. The symbol seemed to be calling to me, promising answers to questions I hadn't known I was asking, offering revelations that existed just beyond the edge of human understanding. My hands moved on the steering wheel without conscious direction, making the subtle adjustments needed to keep my truck centered over the glowing centerline as I approached the massive marking. The heat rising through the floorboards had become almost unbearable, and I could see steam beginning to rise from the edges of the symbol where it met untreated asphalt. Whatever was causing this phenomenon was definitely generating real physical energy, not just the optical illusion I'd been hoping it might be. The CB radio exploded into cacophonous sound that might have been voices, or might have been something else entirely. My GPS screen flickered between showing my location and displaying maps of places I'd never seen, landscapes that looked almost terrestrial but were marked with symbols that matched the ones painted on the road. The engine controls began cycling through their displays of their own accord, showing temperature readings and pressure levels that couldn't possibly be accurate. But it was the feeling that accompanied these technical malfunctions that truly terrified me. As I passed over the symbol, traveling at barely 20 miles per hour now, I felt something vast and ancient brush against my consciousness like fingers made of ice and starlight. It wasn't malevolent, exactly, but it was utterly alien, so far removed from human experience that my mind recoiled from the contact, even as part of me yearned to understand what I was encountering. Images flashed through my thoughts that weren't my own. Visions of this highway being painted not by Caltrans crews with regulation equipment, but by figures in dark clothing who worked by moonlight with buckets of something that glowed like captured fire. I saw them completing their work just as the first hints of dawn touched the eastern horizon, then vanishing into the forest as if they'd never existed at all. But their creation remained, waiting for the right traveler at the right moment to activate whatever purpose it was meant to serve. The sensation of otherworldly contact faded as I reached the center of the symbol, but the heat and electronic interference continued to intensify. My engine temperature gauge finally began to climb, and I could hear warning alarms beginning to sound from multiple systems throughout my truck. Whatever I was driving through was affecting not just the paint and electronics, but my actual mechanical components as well. The logical part of the Interstate 47 overpass near Cedar Falls has been part of my regular route for 15 years now, and in all that time, I never paid it much attention until 3 months ago, when the state decided to resurface the road beneath it. That's when I first heard the screams echoing from somewhere above, bouncing off concrete and steel in ways that made my skin crawl and my hands tighten on the steering wheel of my Peterbilt. I remember that first night clearly because everything about it felt ordinary until it did. The weather was crisp for early October, with just enough chill in the air to fog my breath when I'd stepped out at the truck stop 20 miles back. My cargo hold was loaded with appliance parts bound for Minneapolis. Nothing unusual there, and the highway stretched ahead of me like a familiar ribbon under the amber glow of sodium lamps. The radio was playing some late-night talk show about UFO sightings, the kind of thing that keeps you company during those long stretches when your mind starts to wander and every shadow looks like something it isn't. As I approached the overpass, I noticed the construction crew had left their equipment scattered around the base of the concrete pillars. Orange barrels formed neat lines along the shoulder, and those temporary lights they use cast strange, shifting patterns across the asphalt. The road work had been going on for weeks, turning what used to be a smooth stretch of highway into a maze of lane changes and reduced speeds. I downshifted as I always did, feeling the engine's deep rumble settle into that lower register that vibrates through your bones when you've been driving long enough. It started as a whisper, barely audible over the diesel engine's steady thrum, but as I passed beneath the concrete span, it grew into something unmistakably human. A scream, high and desperate, echoing off the walls and ceiling of the overpass, like it was trapped there, bouncing back and forth with nowhere to go. The sound followed me for maybe 50 yards past the structure before fading into the night, leaving me wondering if I'd imagined the whole thing. I told myself it was probably just wind moving through the construction equipment, or maybe some kind of acoustic trick caused by the way they'd torn up the roadway. Sound does strange things around concrete and steel, especially at night when the temperature drops and everything contracts. I'd heard plenty of odd noises during my years on the road, from the groaning of old bridges to the whistle of wind through trailer gaps, so I filed it away as just another highway oddity and kept rolling toward my delivery deadline. But the sound stayed with me, nagging at the back of my mind like a song you can't quite remember but can't forget either. 2 weeks later, when my route brought me back through Cedar Falls, I found myself slowing down as I approached the overpass, listening carefully as my truck moved beneath it. Sure enough, there it was again, that same desperate screaming, only this time it seemed louder, more distinct. I could almost make out individual voices mixed together in a chorus of anguish that made my stomach clench and my hands sweat despite the cool night air. He was a young guy with tired eyes and coffee stains on his uniform shirt, the kind of person who sees everything that happens on this stretch of highway but doesn't usually talk about it. When I described the screaming sounds, his expression changed, became more guarded, and he glanced around like he was worried someone might overhear us talking. He told me that several drivers had mentioned hearing things around that overpass, especially since they'd started digging deeper during the road work. Nothing official, just whispered conversations during fuel stops and coffee breaks, the kind of talk that spreads through the trucking community like wildfire but never makes it into any official report. He said the construction crew had found some old foundation stones while excavating, remnants of something that used to stand there long before the interstate was built. The foreman had mentioned it to someone who mentioned it to someone else. The way these things travel, but nobody seemed to know exactly what kind of building it had been. I started doing some research during my downtime, visiting local libraries and historical societies in the towns along my route. What I found made the screaming sounds take on a different, more chilling significance. The overpass had been built in the late 1960s on the site of an old county hospital that had burned down in 1952. The hospital had been built in the 1890s and had served the area for over 60 years, treating everything from broken bones to tuberculosis to what they used to call nervous disorders. The fire had happened at night, spreading quickly through the old wooden sections of the building, and 17 people had died, most of them patients who couldn't escape from the upper floors. The newspaper accounts I found described how the screams of the trapped patients had echoed across the valley that night, audible for miles as the flames consumed the building. Witnesses said the sounds seemed to go on forever, long after the roof had collapsed and the walls had fallen in. The site had stood empty for years afterward, too associated with tragedy for anyone to want to rebuild there, until the interstate project came along and buried the ruins under tons of concrete and asphalt. Armed with this knowledge, I approached the overpass differently during my next run through the area. Instead of trying to dismiss the sounds, I listened carefully, trying to understand what I was hearing. The screaming wasn't random or chaotic, I realized, but seemed to follow patterns, rising and falling like waves, sometimes individual voices standing out from the crowd before being swallowed back into the collective cry. It was as if the construction work, the digging and drilling and excavating, had somehow awakened something that had been sleeping beneath the highway for decades. More than I expected, it turned out. Long-haul veterans who'd been running these routes for years described how the overpass had always felt wrong somehow, even before the construction started. Cold spots that made no sense, electronics that malfunctioned for no reason, and a general sense of unease that made them want to get past it as quickly as possible. One driver, an old-timer named Pete, who'd been hauling freight since the Carter administration, told me he'd seen lights moving around the overpass late at night, flickering patterns that looked almost like flames dancing across the concrete surfaces. Another woman, Janet, who ran a refrigerated truck between Chicago and Portland, described how her radio would pick up strange sounds when she passed beneath the structure, voices speaking in languages she didn't recognize mixed with what sounded like crying or moaning. The more stories I collected, the more convinced I became that something significant was happening at that overpass, something connected to the old hospital tragedy and stirred up by the ongoing construction work. But it wasn't until my most recent trip through the area that I realized how dangerous the situation had become. I was running behind schedule that night, pushing to make up time after a delayed pickup in Des Moines, when I approached the overpass around 2 in the morning. The construction zone looked different somehow, more ominous, with shadows that seemed deeper than they should be, and equipment that appeared to have been abandoned mid-task. As I downshifted for the curve, the screaming started earlier than usual, building in intensity as I drew closer to the concrete span. They seemed to be coming from below as well, rising up through the roadway itself, like the asphalt was nothing more than a thin membrane, separating the living world from something much darker underneath. My truck began to vibrate in ways that had nothing to do with engine harmonics, and the temperature inside the cab dropped so suddenly that my breath became visible in the air. The screaming reached a crescendo as I passed beneath the overpass. No longer just human voices, but something else mixed in, something that spoke of ancient pain and endless suffering. My headlights flickered and dimmed, and for a terrifying moment I could see shapes moving in the darkness around me, translucent figures reaching out from the concrete walls, as if trying to claw their way back into the world of the living. I pressed harder on the accelerator, coaxing every bit of speed I could from my heavily loaded truck, not daring to look in my mirrors until I was well clear of the construction zone. When I finally did glance back, I saw lights dancing around the overpass structure, not the steady glow of work lamps, but something that pulsed and writhed like flames, casting shadows that moved independently of any light source. I haven't taken that route since then, choosing instead to add an extra 100 miles to my trips by going around Cedar Falls entirely. Other drivers have started doing the same thing, I've heard, creating an unofficial boycott of Interstate 47 that's beginning to affect shipping schedules and delivery time. The trucking companies are starting to notice, asking questions that none of us quite know how to answer without sounding crazy. The GPS had been acting strange for the last 50 miles, flickering between time zones like it couldn't make up its mind. One moment it showed 11:47 p.m. Mountain Time, the next it jumped to 1:15 a.m. Central, then back to 10:32 p.m. Pacific. I'd been driving long haul for 15 years, hauling everything from appliances to fresh produce across this endless country, and I'd never seen anything quite like it. My Peterbilt's dashboard clock stubbornly held its ground at midnight exactly, the digital numbers glowing amber against the darkness beyond my windshield. But even that seemed wrong somehow, as if time itself had gotten lost somewhere on this lonely stretch of highway. The rain had been falling steadily since I'd crossed the state line, though I wasn't entirely sure which state line that had been anymore. The drops created hypnotic patterns on my windshield, streaming down in rivulets that caught the occasional glow of my headlights bouncing off the wet asphalt ahead. My wipers swept back and forth in their familiar rhythm, a metronome keeping time in a world where time seemed to have become negotiable. The radio had given up on picking up stations hours ago, leaving me with nothing but static that rose and fell like electronic breathing, and the steady hum of my diesel engine eating up the empty mile. When the neon sign appeared through the rain and darkness, floating like a colored ghost in the distance, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. Crossroads Truck Stop, it read in flickering blue and red letters, with 24 hours blazing in yellow beneath. I'd been driving for what felt like an eternity, though the strange behavior of every timepiece around me made it impossible to know for certain. My fuel gauge had been hovering near empty for longer than seemed possible, as if the truck was running on something other than diesel. But I knew I needed to stop before I found myself stranded on this increasingly surreal highway. As I downshifted and guided my rig toward the exit ramp, the first thing I noticed was how the rain seemed to stop the moment I left the main highway, as if I'd driven through an invisible curtain. The second thing I noticed was the absolute silence that replaced the familiar sound of rain on my cab's roof. It wasn't just quiet, it was the kind of profound silence that makes you aware of your own heartbeat, your own breathing, the small sounds your body makes that you never notice when the world is full of its usual noise. The truck stop sprawled before me like something from a different era, all chrome and neon and angles that suggested it had been built in the 1960s and never updated. The parking lot was mostly empty, with only 3 other big rigs scattered across spaces that could have accommodated dozens. Their running lights glowed softly in the strange, still air, but I couldn't see any drivers moving around. The main building sat in the center of it all, a long, low structure with enormous windows that blazed with warm yellow light, promising coffee and conversation, and all the normal things you'd expect from a place like this. I found a parking spot near the building and killed my engine, immediately missing the familiar rumble that had been my constant companion for so many hours. As I climbed down from my cab, I noticed that my boots made no sound when they hit the wet pavement. Not muffled, not quiet, but absolutely no sound at all, as if the very air had lost its ability to carry the vibrations. I looked back at my truck, and for just a moment it seemed translucent in the neon glow, as if I could see right through it to the empty parking spaces beyond. The door to the main building stood propped open, despite the coolness of the night, and warm air drifted out carrying the scent of coffee and fried food and something else, something I couldn't quite identify but that seemed familiar in an unsettling way. As I approached, I could see other people moving around inside, truckers mostly, sitting at tables and standing at the counter, but their movements seemed oddly synchronized, as if they were all following the same slow, deliberate choreography. Inside, the truck stop looked exactly like every truck stop I'd ever been in, and yet completely wrong at the same time. The fluorescent lights hummed with an intensity that seemed to make the air itself vibrate, casting everything in a harsh, flat illumination that somehow created shadows where shadows shouldn't be. The coffee station sat in its expected place along the far wall, but the coffee in the glass pots looked dark as motor oil and seemed to move of its own accord, swirling slowly even though no one was stirring it. Behind the counter stood a woman who might have been 30 or 60, her age seeming to shift depending on the angle of the light. Her name tag read Dolores in cheerful red letters, and she smiled at me with teeth that were too white and too uniform, like she'd borrowed them from someone else. When she spoke, her voice had the quality of an old radio, crackling slightly around the edges, as if it was being transmitted from somewhere far away. "Welcome to Crossroads, honey," she said, her smile never wavering. "You look like you've been driving a long time. How about some coffee?" Fresh pot just finished brewing, though I couldn't tell you exactly when. Time gets a little funny around here. I approached the counter slowly, my boots still making no sound on the linoleum floor, and noticed that the other customers had stopped their conversations to watch me. Not obviously, but in the way people do when they're trying to appear casual while paying careful attention to something. A heavy-set man in a plaid shirt sat at a corner table with a cup of coffee that steamed despite never getting any closer to his mouth. A thin woman with graying hair stood by the newspaper rack, holding the same paper I'd seen her pick up when I'd first walked in, though she showed no signs of actually reading it. I asked Dolores, though I wasn't sure why that seemed like the most important question to ask. Her smile stretched a little wider, and for just a moment I thought I could see something moving behind her eyes. Something that didn't belong in a human face. Time, she repeated, as if the word was foreign to her. Well, now that depends on where you think you are, doesn't it? We get folks from all different zones passing through here. Mountain, Central, Pacific, Eastern, sometimes places that don't have names yet. Clock on the wall says 3:15, but it's been saying that for as long as I can remember. I followed her gaze to the large clock mounted above the coffee station, and she was right. The hands pointed steadily to 3:15, but as I watched I realized they weren't still at all. They were moving, but in a strange rhythmic dance, advancing a few seconds, then sliding backward, then jumping forward again, as if they couldn't decide which direction time was supposed to flow. That's impossible, I said, but my voice sounded distant even to my own ears, as if it was coming from somewhere else entirely. Is it? Asked the heavy-set man at the corner table, though his mouth never moved, and his eyes never left his perpetually steaming coffee. What's impossible about time getting a little confused? Happens to the best of us, doesn't it? You drive long enough, strange enough hours, and pretty soon you don't know if you're coming or going, if it's Tuesday or Thursday, if you're supposed to be in Denver or Detroit. The thin woman by the newspaper rack nodded in agreement, though she still hadn't turned the page she'd been holding when I walked in. Crossroads has always been a place where things get mixed up, she said in a voice like wind through dry leaves. Sit between too many time zones, too many highways, too many different ways of getting from here to there, and eventually the boundaries start to blur. Nothing wrong with that, is there? Sometimes it's nice to take a break from time, don't you think? I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature, and suddenly the warm, bright truck stop felt more like a trap than a refuge. The coffee maker behind the counter gurgled and hissed, but the sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, filling the air with a noise like breathing. The fluorescent lights flickered in a pattern that almost seemed like Morse code, and I found myself trying to decode a message I wasn't sure I wanted to receive. "Oh, but you just got here," Dolores said, and her voice had acquired harmonics, as if several people were speaking at once. "Besides, where exactly do you think you're going? Time doesn't work the same way once you've been here. Outside could be yesterday, could be tomorrow, could be next week or last month. Better to stay where it's warm and bright and the coffee's always fresh." The other customers had turned to face me now, and I could see that their eyes all reflected the fluorescent light in exactly the same way, like mirrors. The thing about driving long haul is that you learn to appreciate the small comforts, and none more so than a warm sleeper cab on a cold night. My Peterbilt's been my home for the better part of 15 years now, and I've got that bunk configured just right. Memory foam topper, electric blanket, even a little reading light that doesn't strain the eye. When you're pulling loads across the northern routes in February, a good sleeping setup isn't luxury, it's survival. I remember that particular night because of how the cold seemed to follow me. I'd been hauling refrigerated goods from Minneapolis down to Kansas City, nothing unusual about the run except for the bitter snap that had settled over the Midwest like a frozen blanket. The kind of cold that makes your diesel gel if you're not careful, where the CB chatter is all about which truck stops still have their pumps working, and who's got the best coffee to warm your bone. By the time I pulled into the rest area just south of Des Moines, the temperature gauge on my dash was reading -8. The wind was howling across the plains with that particular Midwest fury, and I could feel it rocking my rig even with 40,000 pounds of freight keeping me grounded. The other trucks in the lot had their engines running, exhaust stacks puffing white clouds into the black sky like industrial chimneys. Smart drivers, keeping their fuel from turning to jelly. I'd planned to grab maybe 4 hours of sleep before pushing on to make my delivery window. The schedule was tight, but not unreasonable, and I'd driven these routes enough times to know exactly where I could make up time if needed. After completing my post-trip inspection and checking the reefer unit one more time, I climbed into my sleeper and fired up the auxiliary power unit. The familiar hum of the APU always made me feel secure, that steady mechanical heartbeat that meant warmth, power, and comfort through the long night ahead. A quick meal heated on the small inverter microwave, some paperwork to update my logbook, and then the simple pleasure of stretching out on a horizontal surface after 10 hours behind the wheel. The electric blanket was already warming the bunk, and I could feel the tension leaving my shoulders as I prepared for sleep. Maybe it was the way the wind seemed to find every small gap in the cab's weather ceiling, creating tiny drafts that shouldn't have been there. Or perhaps it was how the other trucks in the lot seemed unusually quiet. I was used to hearing the occasional door slam, the murmur of CB conversations, the general sounds of drivers settling in for their mandatory rest period. It wasn't my own. I know the sound of my own respiration well enough, especially the slightly congested wheeze I get when the air is particularly dry. This was different, slower, deeper, and carrying with it a strange quality that made the hair on my arms stand up. Each exhale seemed to carry an unusual chill, as if whoever was breathing was standing in a walk-in freezer. I opened my eyes and lay perfectly still, listening. The APU hummed steadily. The wind buffeted the cab, and somewhere in the distance, another truck's engine rumbled to life. Normal sounds, but underneath it all, that rhythmic breathing continued, and with each exhale, I swear I could feel a cool draft across my face. The logical part of my mind started working through explanation. Maybe there was a problem with the APU's ventilation system, creating some kind of air circulation issue. Perhaps the heating unit was cycling in an unusual way, creating hot and cold spots in the sleeper. I'd heard of electronic systems developing quirks in extreme weather, and -18 certainly qualified as extreme. I reached over and adjusted the thermostat a few degrees higher, listening as the heating system responded. The breathing sound seemed to pause for a moment, as if whatever was making it was also listening. Then it resumed, perhaps a little closer to my bunk than before. The small LED strip lights cast enough of a glow to see the basic outlines of everything. My gear bag, the small refrigerator, the storage compartments, built into the walls. Nothing out of place, nothing that shouldn't be there. But the breathing continued, and now I was certain it wasn't coming from any mechanical source. It seemed to settle on my skin like frost, making me pull the blankets tighter despite the fact that the cab's heater was working perfectly. The temperature readout still showed a comfortable 72 degrees, but I felt like I was lying in a snowbank. I sat up in the bunk, fully alert now, and called out softly, "Hello? Is someone there?" My voice sounded smaller than usual in the confines of the sleeper, almost swallowed by that continuous, measured breathing. For just a moment, the sound stopped entirely, leaving only the mechanical hums and the wind outside. Then it resumed, definitely closer now, as if whatever was making it had moved to the foot of my bunk. I knew my truck inside and out, knew every sound it made, every vibration and mechanical quirk. This wasn't coming from my rig, but the alternative explanations weren't exactly comforting. I reached for the small flashlight I keep clipped to the wall beside my bunk, my fingers fumbling a bit in my haste. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing empty space where the breathing seemed to be originating. But the cold grew stronger, so intense now that I could see my own breath beginning to mist in the flashlight beam, even though the heater was still running full steam. It started as just a few small crystals at the corners, the kind of condensation you might expect if there was a significant temperature differential. But this spread quickly, delicate patterns racing across the glass like someone was drawing with invisible fingers. The breathing grew louder, more insistent, and the cold became almost unbearable. I scrambled for my clothes, suddenly desperate to get out of the sleeper, but my fingers were already starting to stiffen from the cold. The breath vapor from my nose and mouth hung in the air like small clouds, and I realized that whatever was sharing my sleeper space was dropping the temperature despite the APU running at full capacity. The frost patterns on the windows were becoming more elaborate, forming designs that looked almost deliberate. Spirals and geometric shapes that reminded me uncomfortably of the patterns you see on doors of old mausoleums, or etched into the windows of abandoned houses that have stood empty through too many hard winters. And still that breathing continued, each exhale bringing waves of Arctic air that seemed to penetrate right through my skin. Where before it had been steady and rhythmic, now it carried an undertone that sounded almost like satisfaction, as if whatever was creating it was pleased with the effect it was having. The frost on the windows had spread to cover almost the entire surface, and ice was beginning to form on the walls of the sleeper itself. I grabbed my jacket and headed for the cab, but as I reached for the handle of the sleeper's partition door, the breathing suddenly intensified. The temperature plummeted so rapidly that I could feel the moisture in my lungs crystallizing with each breath. My fingers, already stiff with cold, could barely grip the door handle, and when I finally managed to turn it, the metal was so cold it felt like it was burning my skin. The door opened into the cab, and I stumbled through, gasping in the relatively warm air. Behind me I could hear something that might have been a sigh of disappointment, long and low and carrying with it a chill that froze the breath in my throat. I slammed the partition door closed and locked it, then fired up the main engine and cranked the heat to maximum. It took nearly 20 minutes for the feeling to return to my fingers, and another 10 before I stopped shivering. The cab warmed up normally, the engine settled into its familiar idle rhythm, and gradually the terror of what had just happened began to fade into something I could almost convince myself had been a very vivid nightmare. Because when I finally worked up the courage to open the sleeper door again, I found the interior covered in a thin layer of ice that took 3 hours and the full power of the heating system to completely melt. And there in the frost that had formed on the sleeper windows, I could still make out those deliberate patterns, geometric designs that looked far too purposeful to be the random work of condensation. The numbers game. For Marcus, the dashboard modification wasn't supposed to be anything more than a novelty, something to catch the eye of potential buyers when I finally decided to sell my rig. I've been hauling freight across the continental United States for the better part of 23 years, and in that time I've seen every kind of customization imaginable. Chrome that could blind a satellite, sound systems worth more than most people's cars, and interior lighting that would make a nightclub jealous. But this little digital display that Jimmy installed at the truck stop in Barstow was different, and I should have paid more attention to the nervous way his hands shook when he wired it into my electrical system. The display was no bigger than a smartphone screen, nestled perfectly between my speedometer and fuel gauge, its brushed aluminum frame matching the existing dashboard trim, so seamlessly it might have rolled off the factory floor that way. Jimmy called it a motivation counter, programmed to count down from 1 million to 0 over the course of several months, supposedly representing the miles until retirement, or some other personal milestone. He'd gotten the idea from a trucker magazine, he said, though when I asked him which issue he just mumbled something about it being a custom job, and quoted me a price that seemed too reasonable for the quality of work involved. The first few weeks with the counter were unremarkable in the best possible way. The numbers decreased steadily as I rolled through Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas, dropping by increments that roughly corresponded to my daily mileage. There was something oddly satisfying about watching those digits shrink, like marking days off a calendar or watching a savings account grow in reverse. During the long, hypnotic stretches of interstate where the yellow lines blur into a continuous stream, and the engine's diesel rumble becomes as constant as your own heartbeat, I found myself glancing at the display more often than necessary, using it as a focal point during those moments when the road threatens to lull you into the dangerous microsleep that has claimed too many drivers over the years. It was somewhere outside of Oklahoma City, during a particularly brutal night run through freezing rain, that I first noticed the counter behaving strangely. The weather had been deteriorating for hours, the kind of sleet that turns every surface into black ice, and makes every mile feel like a calculated risk. My windshield wipers struggled against the accumulating precipitation, their rhythm growing more labored as ice built up along the rubber edges, and the familiar hum of my engine seemed muffled by the storm. I was reaching for my coffee thermos when I caught sight of the display, and the numbers that glowed back at me made my hand freeze halfway to the cup. Instead of the gradual, predictable countdown I'd grown accustomed to, the display showed a series of digits that seemed to flutter and shift, dropping by large increments that had no relationship to my actual mileage. In the span of watching for perhaps 30 seconds, the number fell by nearly 1,000, then jumped back up by several hundred, then plummeted again as if responding to some invisible force. I tapped the glass with my finger, wondering if moisture had somehow interfered with the electronics, but the display remained stubbornly erratic. The green glow of the numbers seemed brighter than usual too, casting an unsettling light across the interior of my cab that made familiar shadows appear strange and threatening. When I pulled into a truck stop near Tulsa to grab a few hours of mandatory rest, I called Jimmy's shop, hoping he might have some insight into the malfunction. The phone rang endlessly before going to an automated voicemail system that sounded nothing like Jimmy's gravelly voice. Instead of his usual rambling message about shop hours and services, there was only a brief clinical recording stating that the number I'd reached was no longer in service. That struck me as odd, considering I'd been there less than 3 weeks earlier. But equipment malfunctions are a reality of life on the road, and I figured I'd deal with the faulty display when I had more time and better access to electronics repair. The counter's behavior became increasingly unpredictable over the following days, its digital readout seeming to respond to factors that had nothing to do with miles traveled or time elapsed. During particularly stressful moments, like navigating through construction zones or dealing with aggressive drivers, the numbers would plummet rapidly, while periods of smooth, easy cruising seemed to slow the countdown to an almost imperceptible crawl. It was as if the device had become some kind of mood ring for the road, reflecting back the psychological state of my journey in numerical form. The rational part of my mind insisted this was simply confirmation bias, my brain finding patterns where none existed, but the longer I watched the display's seemingly responsive behavior, the harder it became to dismiss as coincidence. The weather had cleared by the time I reached Arkansas, replaced by one of those perfect autumn nights when the air is crisp and clean and the stars are visible despite the scattered light pollution from distant cities. My load was running ahead of schedule, my logbook was in perfect order, and I should have been enjoying one of those rare moments when everything in the trucking world feels aligned and purposeful. Instead, I found myself increasingly fixated on the countdown display, which had begun to exhibit a new and deeply unsettling characteristic. The numbers weren't just changing unpredictably anymore, they were accelerating, dropping at a rate that seemed to increase with each passing hour. What had started as a leisurely countdown from 1,000,000 was now racing through the hundreds of thousands like a stopwatch in the hands of someone frantically clicking the advance button. I tried calculating the rate of decrease, but the acceleration made any mathematical prediction impossible. If the pattern continued, the counter would reach zero within days rather than the months originally intended, though what reaching zero might mean remained a mystery that my mind was reluctant to fully explore. There's something fundamentally unsettling about watching any countdown approach its conclusion, especially when you don't understand the consequences of that final moment. Sleep became increasingly elusive during my mandatory rest periods. Not because of the usual challenges of trying to rest in a truck cab, but because I found myself unable to stop thinking about the display even when it was out of sight. I would lie in my sleeper berth, listening to the subtle settling sounds of the cooling engine and the distant murmur of other trucks idling in the parking lot, while my mind raced through increasingly elaborate theories about what the counter might represent. Perhaps it was counting down to some kind of mechanical failure, programmed by Jimmy to warn of impending engine trouble or electrical system breakdown. Or maybe it was simply a more sophisticated piece of novelty electronics than I'd realized, designed to create exactly this kind of psychological engagement, with some outcome I'd forgotten or misunderstood. The rational explanations became harder to maintain as I crossed into Tennessee and the counter dropped below 50,000. The numbers were falling so rapidly now that I could watch them decrease in real time, each digit shifting and changing with hypnotic regularity. The display had also grown noticeably brighter, its green glow now intense enough to illuminate my entire dashboard even during daylight hours, and occasionally I caught glimpses of what looked like additional information scrolling along the bottom edge of the screen. Text too small and quick to read clearly, but definitely present. My attempts to photograph or video record these messages were frustrated by the way the display seemed to wash out and become illegible whenever I pointed my phone's camera at it, as if it existed only for direct observation. By the time I reached the mountains of eastern Tennessee, the counter was approaching 10,000, and I had begun to experience a growing sense of urgency that went beyond simple curiosity about a malfunctioning electronic device. Every mile felt weighted with significance. Every decision about route and timing seemed to carry consequences I couldn't quite articulate. When I saw the sign for a truck stop at the bottom of a long downgrade, something about the way the counter's glow intensified made me decide to pull off, despite having several hours remaining on my driving clock and a schedule that would benefit from continued progress. The truck stop was one of those older, independently owned establishments that cater to professional drivers rather than tourists, with genuine repair bays and mechanics who understand the specific needs of commercial vehicles. I parked near the service area and walked inside, hoping to find someone who might have experience with aftermarket electronics. But the mechanic on duty just shook his head when I described the display. He'd never seen anything like what I was describing, and when I led him out to my truck to show him the unit, his expression shifted from helpful interest to something approaching concern. The counter now read less than 1,000, its numbers falling so rapidly that individual digits were becoming blurred streaks of light. The display's glow had intensified to the point where it was genuinely uncomfortable to look at directly, and the scrolling text along the bottom had become more pronounced, though still frustratingly illegible. But what had captured the mechanic's attention wasn't the display's behavior, but something else entirely. He pointed at the mounting hardware, the wiring connections, and finally at the space where the display sat nestled in my dashboard, his finger tracing the edges with growing bewilderment. According to his assessment, based on 30 years of experience with truck modifications and aftermarket installations, there was no way the display could be mounted in that location without extensive modification to the dashboard structure. The Crimson Constellation. From Marcus A. The night I saw brake lights hanging in the star-filled sky above Interstate 40, I'd been driving my Kenworth T800 for 14 straight hours through the empty stretches of New Mexico. The desert stretched endlessly on both sides of the highway, broken only by the occasional Joshua tree or weathered billboard advertising long-closed truck stop. My CB radio had been quiet for the last 100 miles, just the soft static that becomes white noise after enough years behind the wheel. I was running a load of electronics from Phoenix to Dallas. Nothing special, just another routine haul that would put decent money in my pocket and keep the bills paid. The truck's diesel engine hummed its familiar lullaby, a sound that had lulled me through thousands of nights like this one. My dashboard lights cast their amber glow across the cab, and the gentle vibration of the road through the steering wheel had become as natural as my own heartbeat. At first I thought it was just fatigue playing tricks on my eyes, those little dancing lights that appear when you've been staring at asphalt for too long. But when I glanced up through my windshield, past the gentle sway of my CB antenna, I saw them clearly against the star-studded sky. Two red lights, perfectly parallel, floating about 30 degrees above the horizon. They had the exact same intensity and spacing as the brake lights on a semi-trailer, that familiar rectangular glow that every trucker recognizes instantly. But these lights were suspended in empty air, with no vehicle, no structure, nothing at all supporting them in the vast darkness above the desert. I eased off the accelerator slightly, letting my speed drop from 75 to about 60, and reached for my CB radio. The static cleared as I keyed the mic, and my voice sounded smaller than usual in the quiet cab. Breaker 19. This is Desert Dog eastbound on the 40 near mile marker 2. Anyone else seeing those lights in the sky? I waited, counting the seconds as static filled the channel, but no response came back through the speaker. The brake lights in the sky maintained their position relative to my truck, moving at exactly the same speed I was traveling. When I accelerated back to 70, they kept pace perfectly. When I slowed to 55, they matched that speed. It was as if some invisible 18-wheeler was driving parallel to me, but several hundred feet above the desert floor, its only visible feature being those two haunting red rectangles against the stars. I tried to rationalize what I was seeing. Maybe it was some kind of military aircraft, though I'd never heard of any plane that showed only brake lights. Could be a helicopter, but the lights were too steady, too perfectly aligned, and I heard no rotor noise above my engine's rumble. Radio towers sometimes had red lights, but these were moving, keeping perfect pace with my truck as mile after mile of empty highway rolled beneath my tires. The desert around me seemed to grow quieter, if such a thing was possible. Even my engine noise seemed muffled, though the tachometer showed normal RPMs and the turbo gauge read steady. The usual small sounds of the cab, the gentle creaking of the sleeper curtain, the soft whistle of air through the door seals, all seemed to fade until there was just the hypnotic hum of tires on asphalt, and those red lights burning in the sky above. I kept driving, mesmerized despite my growing unease. The lights never wavered, never dimmed, never changed their spacing or intensity. They were as constant as the North Star, but moving with me through the New Mexico night, like some celestial escort I'd never requested. My coffee had gone cold in the cup holder, but I didn't want to look away from the windshield long enough to pour a fresh cup from the thermos. Around mile marker 2085, I crested a small hill and saw something that made my blood run cold. Ahead of me, perhaps 2 miles down the highway, was the distinctive glow of emergency flashers. Red and amber lights blinked in a pattern I recognized immediately. A truck pulled over on the shoulder, hazards running. As I got closer, I could make out the dark silhouette of a semi-trailer against the starfield, its chrome bumper catching my headlight beams. But when I looked up at the sky, the brake lights were still there, still maintaining their impossible position above and ahead of my cab. If there was a truck on the shoulder below, what was casting those lights in the heavens? I keyed my CB again, this time with more urgency in my voice. Breaker for the driver on the shoulder at mile 2085. You got your ears? Static answered me, punctuated by the occasional pop of distant lightning, though I saw no storm clouds in the clear desert sky. It was a blue Peterbilt, similar vintage to my own Kenworth, with a standard dry van trailer. The truck looked normal enough, except for one detail that made my hands tighten on the steering wheel. Where the trailer's brake lights should have been, there was only darkness. 2 rectangular spaces that should have glowed red with the activation of the hazard flashers showed nothing but black, as if the lights had been carefully removed, or had simply ceased to exist. I slowed my truck to a crawl, debating whether to stop and check on the driver. The side windows of the Peterbilt were too dark to see inside, and something about the scene felt wrong in a way I couldn't articulate. The truck sat perfectly level on the shoulder, no sign of mechanical trouble, no indication of why it would be stopped in the middle of nowhere at 3 in the morning, and those missing brake lights bothered me more than they should. That's when I realized the lights in the sky had changed position. They were no longer ahead of me, but directly overhead now, casting a faint red glow through my windshield onto the dashboard. The light was subtle, barely noticeable, but it gave everything in my cab a crimson tint that reminded me of old darkroom photography. I pressed the accelerator, suddenly eager to put distance between myself and the mysterious stopped truck. My speedometer climbed past 70, then 75, then 80 as I pushed my Kenworth harder than I normally would on an unfamiliar stretch of highway. But the brake lights in the sky kept pace effortlessly, maintaining their position directly above my cab. In my side mirrors I could see the glow of the stopped truck's flashers growing smaller, but the red light from above seemed to be growing stronger. The words were unclear, but the tone was urgent, almost desperate. It sounded like someone calling for help, but the transmission was too garbled to understand. I grabbed the mic and responded, "Say again, driver. You're breaking up bad." But the radio fell silent again, returning to its steady static hiss. That's when I noticed my fuel gauge. The needle had dropped from 3/4 to just under half in what seemed like minutes. I knew I'd filled up in Flagstaff, and my Caterpillar engine was known for its fuel efficiency. At this rate, I'd be running on fumes long before I reached my next planned stop in Amarillo. The engine temperature was climbing too, though not yet into the danger zone, and my turbo boost seemed sluggish when I pressed the accelerator. The brake lights above began to descend slowly, maintaining their horizontal orientation as they dropped closer to my truck. What had been hundreds of feet above me was now maybe 50 feet, close enough that I could see they weren't just points of light, but actual rectangular fixtures, identical to the ones that should have been on the rear of any commercial trailer. They cast enough illumination now to light up the hood of my truck with that eerie red glow. On Channel 19 I heard the faint sound of country music, as if someone had left their radio keyed with the volume turned down. Channel 17 carried what sounded like breathing, slow and steady, but no voice responded to my call. The emergency channel gave me nothing but static that seemed to pulse in rhythm with the brake lights overhead. The highway ahead began to climb toward a mountain pass. I didn't remember from previous trips through this area. The brake lights dropped lower still, now close enough that I felt I could almost reach them if I opened my sunroof. My engine was working harder now, the turbocharger whining with effort, though my load wasn't particularly heavy, and the grade wasn't steep enough to cause such strain. At the crest of the pass, the highway curved sharply to the left, and as I navigated the turn, the brake lights suddenly shot upward with incredible speed, disappearing back into the star-filled sky so quickly I might have imagined them. The shadow that follows. The rain had been my companion for the last 200 miles. Drumming steadily against the windshield of my Peterbilt as I navigated the winding mountain roads of eastern Tennessee. The rhythmic thrum of the diesel engine beneath me provided a comforting counterpoint to the storm outside, and I'd grown accustomed to the hypnotic dance of the wipers clearing away the endless streams of water. It was well past midnight when I first noticed something unusual in my rear-facing camera display. I'd been driving these routes for nearly 15 years, hauling everything from furniture to electronics across the southeastern states, and I prided myself on being observant. The camera system was a recent addition to my rig, installed just 3 months prior after a close call with a distracted driver who'd tried to slip into my blind spot. The small screen mounted to my dashboard gave me a clear view of the trailer's rear and the road behind me, and I'd quickly grown dependent on its watchful electronic eye. A dark shape, roughly the size of a large dog, seemed to materialize at the very edge of the camera's range, before disappearing into the darkness beyond the reach of my trailer's taillight. The mountain roads were notorious for wildlife crossings, and I'd encountered my share of deer, raccoons, and even the occasional black bear during my years on these routes. But something about this particular shadow felt different, more deliberate in its movement. I adjusted my grip on the steering wheel and leaned forward slightly, studying the grainy image on the small screen. The rain continued its relentless assault on the asphalt behind me, creating an ever-shifting pattern of reflections in the red glow of my brake light. For several minutes, nothing appeared out of the ordinary, and I began to convince myself that fatigue and the hypnotic rhythm of the storm had simply played tricks on my eye. The radio crackled with static as I reached for the dial, searching for something to break the monotonous silence that had settled over the cab. Most stations had faded to white noise hours ago, leaving me with only the distant echo of a late-night talk show discussing conspiracy theories and unexplained phenomena. The host's voice drifted in and out of clarity as the signal fought against the interference of the storm, creating an oddly fitting soundtrack for the lonely mountain highway. It was during a particularly vivid description of phantom hitchhiker sightings that the shape appeared again in my rear camera. This time it lingered long enough for me to get a better look, and what I saw made my hands tighten involuntarily on the wheel. The creature, for lack of a better term, appeared to be running behind my trailer, keeping pace with my 60-mile-per-hour speed, with an ease that defied natural explanation. Its form was distinctly canine, with the lean build and pointed ears of a German shepherd or similar breed, but there was something ethereal about its appearance, as if it were composed of shadow and mist rather than flesh and bone. The strangest aspect was how it seemed to glide rather than run, its paws never quite touching the wet pavement. Its mouth hung open in what might have been exertion or excitement, and even through the low resolution of the camera, I could see what appeared to be its tongue lolling to one side. But there was no visible breath in the cold mountain air, no steam rising from its body despite the obvious effort of maintaining such incredible speed. The phantom dog kept pace effortlessly, never falling behind despite the increased velocity. Its eyes, when they caught the reflection of my taillights, seemed to glow with an inner light that had nothing to do with the mechanical illumination of my truck's electrical system. The rational part of my mind searched for explanations. Perhaps it was an optical illusion created by the rain and the camera's night vision settings. Maybe debris caught in the wind was creating the impression of movement. But as I watched the creature's steady gait and the clear definition of its features, these logical explanations crumbled away, leaving me with the unsettling realization that something genuinely inexplicable was following me through the Tennessee mountains. I reached for my CB radio, intending to contact other drivers who might be traveling this route, but the device produced only static and the occasional burst of unintelligible chatter. The isolation that had seemed peaceful just hours before now felt oppressive and threatening. The mountain road stretched endlessly ahead of me, with no signs of civilization beyond the occasional reflective mile marker catching my headlight. Instead of maintaining its position directly behind the trailer, it started to weave from side to side, as if trying to get my attention or communicate some urgent message. Its mouth opened wider, and though I couldn't hear anything over the engine noise and storm, its body language suggested it was barking or howling. The sight sent an involuntary chill down my spine, and I found myself checking my mirrors more frequently, half expecting to see the creature somehow alongside my cab. As we approached a small roadside rest area, nothing more than a gravel pullout, with a few picnic tables and a weather-beaten information sign, the phantom dog's behavior became increasingly agitated. It began running in tight circles behind the trailer, occasionally leaping into the air with an athleticism that seemed to defy gravity. Then, without warning, it bolted toward the rest area and disappeared entirely from the camera's view. Curiosity and concern warred within me. As I passed the darkened pullout, something had clearly upset the creature, and despite my rational mind's insistence that this was all some elaborate hallucination brought on by exhaustion and isolation, I felt compelled to investigate. I continued for another quarter mile before finding a safe place to turn around, the trailer's air brakes hissing as I brought the massive vehicle to a stop. The rear camera showed nothing but empty road and falling rain, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched from somewhere beyond the reach of my light. The radio continued its static-filled broadcast of paranormal encounters, the host's voice now seeming to speak directly to my situation, as he described the territorial nature of guardian spirits and their tendency to appear during times of danger. I pulled into the rest area slowly, my headlights sweeping across the simple wooden picnic tables and the small informational kiosk. Everything appeared normal at first glance, but as I maneuvered the truck to get a better view of the area, my lights illuminated something that made my blood run cold. Scattered across the gravel were the unmistakable remains of a vehicle accident, pieces of twisted metal and broken glass that had been invisible from the road. Upon closer inspection, I could make out the crumpled shell of what had once been a small sedan, now barely recognizable after what must have been a devastating crash. The vehicle had somehow ended up partially hidden behind the information kiosk, explaining why passing traffic hadn't spotted it. How long it had been there was impossible to determine, but the rust and vegetation growing through the broken windows suggested it hadn't been recent. As I sat in my cab, engine idling and emergency flashers activated, I reached for my cell phone to call for help. The screen showed no signal, which wasn't surprising given our remote location, but I knew I couldn't simply drive away and leave the scene unreported. I was preparing to proceed to the next town to contact authorities when movement in my rear camera caught my attention once again. Its posture was alert but peaceful, and as I watched it seemed to nod once before beginning to fade away like morning mist touched by sunlight. Within seconds it had vanished completely, leaving only the rain-soaked asphalt and the glow of my taillight. I remained at the rest area for another 20 minutes, waiting to see if the creature would reappear, but the camera showed nothing unusual for the remainder of my stay. When I finally pulled back onto the highway, I couldn't help but check the screen every few seconds, part of me hoping and part of me dreading another sighting of my mysterious pursuer. The radio had finally given up its ghost entirely, leaving only the steady rumble of the engine and the gradually diminishing patter of rain as the storm moved east. I reported the accident to the local sheriff's department, providing detailed directions to the hidden wreck, and learned that a vehicle matching that description had been reported missing nearly 2 years early. Now, months later, as I continue to run freight through those same Tennessee mountains, I still check my rear camera more frequently than necessary. The phantom dog has never returned, but sometimes on particularly dark and stormy nights, I catch myself searching the shadowy edges of the screen, wondering if somewhere out there, a faithful guardian continues its eternal patrol of those bells. The Freight Yard of Lost Shadow. From Marcus Chen. The thing about driving freight at 3 in the morning is that you start to recognize the places where the world feels thin, where reality seems to bend at the edges like heat shimmer on summer asphalt. I'd been hauling loads between Portland and Sacramento for 8 years, and I thought I knew every truck stop, every way station, every freight yard along that stretch of ice. But sometimes the road shows you something new, something that makes you question whether you've been driving the same route at all. Rain had been drumming against my windshield for the past 100 miles, a steady percussion that mixed with the low rumble of my Peterbilt's engine to create a hypnotic rhythm. The wipers swept back and forth in their eternal dance, clearing the glass just long enough for the water to claim it again. My CB radio crackled with the occasional exchange between other night haulers, their voices distant and tinny through the static. The highway stretched endlessly ahead, painted white lines disappearing into the darkness beyond my headlights. I was carrying a load of electronics bound for a distribution center in Stockton. Nothing unusual about that. The trailer behind me held its weight steady as I navigated the gentle curves of the interstate, and my diesel engine hummed its familiar song. But something felt different that night, though I couldn't put my finger on what exactly. The air seemed thicker somehow, charged with an electricity that had nothing to do with the storm outside. It appeared in my headlights like a ghost materializing from the rain, weathered green metal with white letters that seemed to glow with their own light. Central Valley Freight Services. Below it, an arrow pointed toward an exit I'd never seen before, though I'd driven this exact stretch of highway hundreds of times. The sign looked old, older than it should have been, with rust stains that ran down its face like tears. Curiosity got the better of me, as it often does during those long, lonely hours behind the wheel. I had time to spare before my scheduled delivery, and freight yards were usually good places to grab coffee and stretch your legs. I signaled and took the exit, my truck's engine downshifting as we left the main highway behind. The off-ramp curved through a stand of eucalyptus trees, their pale bark ghostly in my headlights. The rain seemed to ease up as I drove deeper into the countryside, though fog began to roll in from somewhere, creeping across the narrow access road like reaching fingers. My headlights cut through the mist, revealing glimpses of agricultural fields on either side, though the crops looked strange, too tall and too dark for anything I recognized. The road twisted and turned for what felt like much longer than 2 miles before I finally saw lights ahead. But these weren't the harsh fluorescent floods you'd expect at a working freight yard. Instead, a warm amber glow filtered through the fog, soft and inviting like candlelight through frosted glass. As I drew closer, the outline of the facility began to emerge from the mist. Central Valley Freight Services sprawled across several acres, but it looked like something from another era. The main building was a low brick structure with Art Deco styling, its windows glowing with that same amber light. Vintage neon signs advertised services in elegant script fonts, their colors muted by age and weather. But it was the trucks that really caught my attention. Chrome gleamed despite the moisture in the air, and their paint jobs were immaculate. Deep colors that seemed to absorb and reflect the amber lighting in impossible way. I saw Kenworths and Peterbilts, Max and Freightliners, all sporting the classic cab-over designs and elaborate chrome work that marked them as relics from trucking's golden age. I pulled into the yard slowly, my modern Peterbilt feeling suddenly out of place among these pristine antiques. The fog swirled around my wheels as I parked near the main building, and I noticed that despite the apparent age of the facility, everything was in perfect condition. No rust, no wear, no signs of the decay that time inevitably brings to places like this. The engine's rumble died away as I shut down, leaving only the soft patter of rain on my roof and the distant hum of generators. I grabbed my jacket and climbed down from the cab, my boots splashing in puddles that reflected the neon signs like liquid gemstone. The air smelled of diesel and rain, but underneath there was something else, something sweet and cloying that reminded me of flowers left too long in a vase. I could hear music drifting from inside, the kind of big band jazz that my grandfather used to play on his old radio. As I approached, I caught glimpses of movement through the windows, shadows of people moving about their business inside. But when I stepped through the doorway, the room was empty. Not just empty, but silent. The music had stopped the moment I crossed the threshold, and the amber light revealed a space frozen in time. Chrome stools lined a lunch counter, their red vinyl seats cracked with age. A coffee pot sat on a burner behind the counter, steam rising from its spout, but no one was there to tend it. Vintage trucking magazines lay scattered on tables, their pages yellowed and brittle, featuring articles about drivers and companies I'd never heard of. I called out a greeting, but my voice seemed to be absorbed by the walls, falling flat and lifeless in the strange acoustics of the room. My footsteps echoed on the checkered linoleum as I walked toward the counter, noting the price list chalked on a board behind the register. Coffee for a dime, sandwiches for 35 cents, diesel fuel for 18 cents a gallon. That's when I noticed the photographs. They covered an entire wall, hundreds of black and white images arranged in neat rows. At first glance, they appeared to be portraits of drivers, the kind of promotional photos that trucking companies used to take of their employees. But as I looked closer, something about them made my skin crawl. The drivers in the pictures all had the same expression, a distant gaze that seemed to look right through the camera, through me toward something far beyond the frame of the photograph. In every single picture, the shadows fell in directions that defied the lighting. Some drivers cast multiple shadows, others seemed to have no shadow at all, while a few appeared to be nothing but shadow, dark silhouettes in the shape of men wearing trucker caps and work shirts. I found myself staring at these images, transfixed by their subtle wrongness, when I heard the sound of diesel engines starting up outside. I hurried to the window and looked out into the yard. The vintage trucks were moving, pulling out of their parking spaces in a slow, deliberate procession. But I couldn't see any drivers through their windshields, just that same amber glow that seemed to emanate from within the cabs themselves. The trucks formed a convoy, their chrome bumpers gleaming as they wound their way through the yard toward an exit on the far side of the facility. My rational mind told me to leave, to get back in my truck and return to the highway, back to the familiar world of rest stops and way stations and CB radio chatter. But something held me there, a fascination that bordered on compulsion. I watched as the ghostly convoy disappeared into the fog, their taillights fading like dying embers. Just the empty room with its vintage fixtures and wall of impossible photographs. But I could swear I felt the impression of fingers through my jacket, and the air around me had grown cold enough that my breath began to mist. I backed toward the door, never taking my eyes off the photographs. In the shifting light, the shadowy figures in the pictures seemed to be moving, turning their heads to follow my retreat. The sweet, cloying smell grew stronger, and I realized it wasn't flowers at all, but something else, something organic and wrong that made my stomach turn. My hand found the door handle just as the lights began to flicker. Not the steady dimming of failing power, but a deliberate pattern, like Morse code spelled out in amber illumination. In those flashes of darkness between the pulses, I saw shapes moving in my peripheral vision, tall figures that vanished the moment I tried to look directly at them. I stumbled outside into the rain, desperate for the clean smell of water and diesel exhaust. My truck sat where I'd left it, solid and real, and wonderfully modern, among the empty spaces where the vintage convoy had been parked. I ran for the cab, my boots slipping on the wet pavement, and hauled myself up behind the wheel. The GPS unit had been a gift from my daughter Sarah before she stopped talking to me 3 years ago. It was one of those fancy aftermarket ones, with the big screen and the voice that sounded almost human, not like the robotic directions you get from phone. She'd saved up her money from her part-time job at the bookstore to buy it for me, said she worried about me getting lost on these long hauls. Back then, I thought it was sweet. Now every time I looked at its blue glow on my dashboard, it felt like a reminder of every conversation we never had, every birthday I missed while chasing miles and paychecks across the interstate. I was pulling a load of electronics from Portland to Denver, running through the night to make up time after a delay at the loading dock. The Kenworth hummed steady beneath me, its engine a familiar lullaby that had sung me through countless nights over the past 25 years. Rain drummed against the windshield in a rhythm that matched my wipers, and the highway stretched ahead like a black ribbon threaded with yellow stitches. It was the kind of night that made you think too much, when the darkness outside seemed to seep into your thoughts and drag up all the things you'd rather leave buried. The familiar blue interface was gone, replaced by something that looked older, more basic. The voice that had guided me for years, that pleasant female tone Sarah had picked because she said it sounded like her favorite teacher, had changed too. Now it sounded deeper, more gravelly, like someone who'd spent too many years smoking cigarettes in truck stop diners. I'd driven this route dozens of times, knew it like the back of my weathered hands. Interstate 84 East was my road, straight through the Columbia River Gorge and then south. But the GPS was insistent, its red line showing a route I'd never seen before, winding through what looked like empty country. Recalculating, I muttered to myself, reaching to tap the screen. But before I could touch it, the voice spoke again. "This route will take you where you need to go, Marcus. Trust me." The use of my name sent a chill down my spine. I'd programmed the GPS years ago, sure, but it had never addressed me personally before. GPS units gave directions. They didn't have conversation. I considered pulling over, maybe resetting the system, but the exit was coming up fast, and something in that voice, something almost familiar, made me slow down and signal right. The off-ramp curved into darkness, leading away from the well-lit interstate and into country that seemed swallowed by the night. The rain had intensified, turning my windshield into a cascade of silver streams that the wipers could barely keep clear. My headlights carved tunnels through the darkness, illuminating wet asphalt that looked like it hadn't seen traffic in years. The center line was faded, the road signs weathered and barely readable. "Continue straight for 15 miles, the GPS instructed. "You're going to want to remember this drive, Marcus." My hands tightened on the steering wheel. There was definitely something wrong with the unit. Some glitch that was making it say things that sounded too personal, too knowing. But I kept driving, partly because I wasn't sure how to get back to the interstate from here, and partly because something about this route felt inevitable, like I'd been meant to take it all along. The landscape outside was difficult to make out through the rain, but it seemed familiar in a way that made my chest tight. Rolling hills covered in scrub brush, the occasional farmhouse with windows that glowed yellow in the distance. It reminded me of the country around the town where I'd grown up, where Sarah had spent her first 5 years before the divorce, before I'd started driving long haul to escape the wreckage of my marriage and ended up missing most of her childhood in the process. "Turn right in 1 mile, the GPS said. "You remember this road, don't you, Marcus?" I wanted to argue with it, to insist that I'd never been here before, but as I made the turn onto an even narrower road, recognition hit me like a physical blow. This was Maple Creek Road, the way to Sarah's elementary school. I'd driven it every morning for those few months when I'd been trying to be a good father after the divorce, but before I'd given up and thrown myself into the road full time. But that had been in California, 3 states and 1,000 miles away. There was no way this road could be the same one. Yet, as I drove, landmarks appeared in my headlights that couldn't be explained away. The crooked fence post where Sarah had made me stop once to pet a horse. The old oak tree that had been struck by lightning, its trunk split but still standing. The mailbox painted to look like a cardinal that she'd always pointed out, saying it looked happy. In 500 feet, your destination will be on the right, the GPS announced. My destination? I didn't have a destination on this road. My delivery was in Denver, still hundreds of miles away, but then I saw it, and my breath caught in my throat. Lincoln Elementary School, exactly as it had looked 15 years ago, down to the faded blue paint on the playground equipment and the banner advertising a long-past fundraiser hanging between two posts. I pulled into the empty parking lot, my truck's engine diesel clatter seeming too loud in the stillness. The rain had softened to a gentle patter, and through my windshield, I could see lights on in one of the classrooms. A small figure moved past the window, and my heart began to race. "You have arrived at your destination," the GPS said, but the voice had changed again. Now it sounded like Sarah, but not Sarah as she was now, as an adult with her own life and justified anger. This was Sarah as she'd been at 7 years old, gap-toothed and full of forgiveness. "Daddy, you came to see my presentation," the voice said. The memory hit me like a semi running a red light. The presentation about family trees, the one she'd worked on for weeks, the one I'd promised to attend, the one I'd missed because a dispatcher had called with a rush load to Chicago. I'd chosen the money over my daughter's proud smile, told myself it was for her future, for her college fund. But really, it had been because the road was easier than facing the disappointment in her eyes, easier than admitting I had no idea how to be the father she deserved. I climbed down from the cab, my boots splashing in puddles that reflected the school's security lights. The building looked exactly as it had, but wrong somehow, like a photograph that had been slightly overexposed. The colors were too bright, the edges too sharp. I walked toward the lighted window, driven by a need I couldn't name. Inside the classroom, I could see them, 20-some 7-year-olds sitting in tiny plastic chairs, their attention focused on the front of the room. And there was Sarah, standing beside a poster board, covered in photographs and careful childish writing, her dark hair in the braids I'd learned to make during those brief months when I'd tried to be both mother and father to her. She was talking about family traditions, about the trips we were going to take together, about how her daddy drove a big truck and saw the whole country. Her voice was muffled by the glass, but I could see her eyes scanning the room, looking for me among the parents who'd actually shown up. The hope in her expression was like a knife twisting in my chest. I pressed my hand against the window, wanting to call out to her, to tell her I was here. I'd finally made it. But even as I watched, her shoulders began to slump. Her voice grew quieter. She looked toward the door one more time, then back at her presentation, and I saw the exact moment when hope died in her 7-year-old eyes. "She waited for you," the GPS voice said from behind me. I spun around, but there was no one there, just my truck idling in the parking lot. "She always waited for you, Marcus." Even when she stopped saying so, the scene in the classroom began to repeat, like a loop of film. Sarah standing up, beginning her presentation, looking for me, wilting when I didn't appear. Over and over, that moment of disappointment, that first crack in the foundation of trust between us that would eventually become an unbridgeable chasm. I ran back to my truck, desperation clawing at my throat. This wasn't real, couldn't be. I was probably asleep at a rest stop somewhere, dreaming guilt-fueled nightmares, but the rain on my face felt real, the cold metal of the door handle solid under my grip, the needle that never rests. From Marcus Holloway. The speedometer in my Kenworth T80X had been acting strange for 3 weeks now, but I figured it was just another quirk in a rig that had seen better decades. The needle would jump from 40 to 70 without me touching the accelerator, then settle back down like nothing happened. My dispatcher kept complaining about my delivery times being inconsistent, but I couldn't explain what was happening without sounding like I'd lost my mind somewhere between Tulsa and Kansas City. It was a Thursday night in late October when everything changed. The kind of night where the fog rolls in thick from the Missouri River and turns the interstate into a tunnel of amber light and shadow. I was hauling a load of electronics from Kansas City to Denver. Nothing special. Just another routine run that should have taken me through the night and into Friday morning. The radio crackled with weather warnings about visibility dropping to near zero in some areas. But I'd driven through worse and my deadline was tight enough that stopping wasn't really an option. The first thing I noticed was how steady the speedometer had become. For weeks it had been dancing around like a nervous cat, but now the needle sat perfectly still at exactly 65 miles per hour. I pressed the accelerator harder, feeling the Cummins engine respond with that familiar growl, but the needle didn't budge. When I eased off the gas, expecting to slow down for the construction zone ahead, the speedometer remained frozen at 65, even though I could feel the truck maintaining its pace through the orange cones and flashing lights. The fog grew thicker as I pushed west through Kansas, turning my headlights into useless tunnels that barely penetrated 10 feet ahead. Other drivers were pulling off at every truck stop, their hazard lights blinking like distress signals in the murk. But something kept me moving forward. Maybe it was the way the speedometer needle seemed to pulse faintly in the dashboard light, or maybe it was the strange rhythm I'd started to feel in the steering wheel, like a heartbeat traveling up from the highway through my tires. I tried adjusting my speed for a curve near Salina, one of those sweeping bends that can catch you off guard if you're not paying attention. I pressed the brake pedal, felt it depress normally, heard the air brakes respond with their familiar hiss, but the speedometer never moved from 65. The curve came and went without incident, the truck handling exactly as it should have at the lower speed I was sure I'd achieved, but the instrument panel insisted otherwise. The fuel gauge was moving normally, the oil pressure and coolant temperature readings fluctuated as expected, but that speedometer needle might as well have been painted on the glass. They were passing by at intervals that felt wrong, too fast for any reasonable speed, even though my dashboard claimed I was maintaining a steady 65. I began counting the seconds between markers, trying to do the math in my head, but the fog made it difficult to spot them consistently and the numbers never seemed to add up right. Sometimes a marker would appear just 30 seconds after the last one. Sometimes it would be 2 minutes, but the speedometer never wavered. I tried calling out my location a few times, but my radio seemed to be transmitting into dead air. No one acknowledged my calls. No one responded when I asked if anyone else was experiencing instrument problems. The CB channels that were usually full of chatter, complaints about dispatchers, weather updates and the general camaraderie of the road, had gone silent except for the soft hiss of static. That's when I started paying attention to the other vehicles around me. At first I thought the fog was just making it hard to see traffic, but as the night wore on, I realized I hadn't seen another set of taillights or oncoming headlights for over an hour. The interstate should have had at least some traffic, even in these conditions, but the road ahead and behind me appeared completely empty. I was alone on I-70, traveling at exactly 65 miles per hour according to my instruments, passing mile markers at impossible intervals, with no other sign of human presence anywhere in the thick gray world outside my windshield. I reached for my cell phone to call dispatch, but the screen showed no signal bars despite being in an area where I'd never had coverage problems before. The clock on my dashboard had stopped at 12:17, though my phone showed it was well past 2 in the morning. Time seemed to be moving differently inside the cab, flowing like thick syrup, while the mile markers continued their erratic countdown outside. The heater was working normally, keeping me comfortable, but I found myself shivering anyway as a cold that had nothing to do with temperature settled into my bones. I should have been burning diesel at a normal rate, but the needle was dropping faster than it should have been, as if the engine was working much harder than the speedometer indicated. I started looking for truck stops, but the familiar signs for fuel and food seemed to have vanished along with the other traffic. The highway stretched endlessly ahead, a ribbon of asphalt disappearing into fog that never thinned or shifted, never revealed anything beyond the reach of my headlights. At first I thought it might be tire noise or wind, but it had a musical quality that made the hair on my arms stand up. It was like a chorus of voices, too distant to make out words, but definitely human and definitely not random noise. The humming rose and fell in waves, sometimes matching the rhythm of my engine, sometimes counterpointing it like a harmony that had been traveling this highway for decades, waiting for the right driver to hear it. The speedometer needle began to glow more brightly, not with the normal backlight illumination, but with a phosphorescent gleam that reminded me of old watch dials that absorbed light during the day and gave it back at night. The glow pulsed in time with the humming from below, and I realized that both the sound and the light were growing stronger as the night progressed. My truck was being drawn into something that existed parallel to the normal world of highways and shipping schedules, something that measured distance and time by different rules entirely. I tried downshifting, hoping to force the engine to work against itself and slow the truck through mechanical resistance. But while I could hear and feel the transmission respond, the speedometer remained locked at 65. The mile markers were now appearing every few seconds, flashing past like a strobe light show, each one marking progress toward a destination that wasn't on any map I'd ever studied. The fog began to take on colors at the edges of my vision, deep purples and greens that swirled like oil on water, beautiful and terrifying at the same time. Dawn should have been approaching, but the darkness outside remained absolute except for the dancing colors in the fog and the increasingly bright glow from my speedometer. The humming had grown into something I could feel in my chest, a vibration that seemed to be tuning my heartbeat and breathing to its rhythm. I was becoming part of whatever force controlled this highway, my truck transformed into something that existed between the normal world and somewhere else entirely. The first exit sign I'd seen in hours appeared suddenly in my headlights, but the destination name was written in symbols that hurt my eyes to look at directly. I yanked the steering wheel hard to the right, fighting against a resistance that felt like the truck wanted to continue straight, and somehow managed to take the exit, despite the speedometer's insistence that I was traveling too fast to make such a sharp turn. The moment my tires left the interstate, everything changed. The fog lifted instantly, revealing a truck stop that blazed with normal fluorescent light. My speedometer dropped to 0 as I coasted into the parking lot, the needle falling like a stone. Other trucks sat in neat rows, their drivers probably sleeping peacefully in their bunks, unaware that anything unusual had happened. My radio crackled back to life with normal chatter. My cell phone showed full signal strength, and my dashboard clock started ticking forward again from 12:17. I sat in that parking lot until real dawn painted the eastern sky pink and gold, afraid to look too closely at my logbook, afraid to calculate how many miles I'd apparently traveled in a night that had lasted only 3 hours, according to my phone. When I finally worked up the courage to check my fuel gauge, it read exactly the same as when I'd started noticing the speedometer problem back in Kansas City. I'd driven hundreds of impossible miles on no fuel at all, carried by something that had been waiting in the fog for a truck whose instruments were just broken enough to let it in. I still drive that route sometimes, Kansas City to Denver through the heart of the country, but I've had my speedometer replaced and I pay careful attention to weather reports. On foggy nights when the visibility drops and the radio chatter dies down, I can still hear that humming underneath my engine noise, calling from the highway, the weight of the road. From Marcus Webb, it's not the satisfying crunch of gravel or the wet slap of mud, but something altogether different, like the whisper of sand through an hourglass, amplified and drawn out until it becomes almost hypnotic. I've been driving 18-wheelers for 23 years, hauling everything from refrigerated produce to heavy machinery across the continental United States, and I thought I'd seen every kind of road condition this country had to offer. But that night on Highway 2087, somewhere between the Colorado border and the endless stretch of Kansas wheat fields, I discovered that the road itself could betray you in ways that defied every law of physics I thought I understood. My Peterbilt 379 was loaded with a shipment of ceramic tiles bound for Kansas City, the trailer riding heavy but balanced behind me as I maintained a steady 70 miles per hour through the gathering dusk. The radio crackled with the usual chatter between drivers, warnings about construction zones and speed traps. the occasional weather update promising clear skies through the night. My coffee was still warm in the thermos wedged between my seat and the center console, and the familiar hum of the Caterpillar engine beneath the hood provided that rhythmic soundtrack that had become as comforting as a heartbeat over the years. The sun had just disappeared behind the horizon when I first noticed something unusual about the pavement ahead. The headlights cast their familiar cone of illumination across the asphalt, but there seemed to be subtle variations in the surface texture that I couldn't quite identify. From a distance it looked like heat mirages, those shimmering pools of false water that appear on hot summer days, but the temperature had been dropping steadily since sunset, and my dashboard thermometer read a comfortable 68 degrees. As I drew closer to these distortions in the road surface, I felt the steering wheel give a slight tremor in my hands. It was subtle at first, barely noticeable, like the gentle vibration you might feel if you drove over a painted lane mark. But as my front tires made contact with what appeared to be perfectly normal asphalt, the tremor intensified into a distinct pulling sensation, as if the road itself was trying to grip my wheels with invisible fingers. The engine note changed slightly, the RPMs dropping as the truck encountered unexpected resistance. I downshifted automatically, muscle memory taking over as my conscious mind tried to process what was happening. The tachometer needle fluctuated between green and yellow, and I could feel the trailer behind me swaying just enough to let me know that something was fundamentally wrong with this stretch of highway. Through the windshield I watched in growing bewilderment as the pavement directly in front of my truck began to behave in ways that seemed to mock everything I knew about solid ground. The asphalt appeared to ripple gently, like the surface of a pond disturbed by a thrown stone, and my tires were leaving impressions in the road as if I were driving through warm tar instead of the hard, sun-baked surface it appeared to be during daylight hours. The CB radio burst to life with static-filled voices. Other drivers were reporting similar phenomena along this same stretch of highway. A gravelly voice that sounded like it belonged to a veteran trucker with decades of experience crackled through the speaker, describing how his dual rear axles were sinking nearly 4 inches into what looked like perfectly solid pavement. Another driver, his voice tight with barely controlled panic, reported that his fuel economy had dropped dramatically as his engine worked overtime to pull his rig through road surface that felt like quicksand but looked completely normal in his mirror. I reduced my speed to 50 miles per hour, then 40. But the sinking sensation only grew worse. My logbook and coffee cup rattled on the dashboard as the truck lurched through what felt like invisible potholes that corresponded perfectly with the strange shimmering patches in the asphalt. The steering required constant correction as the front wheels found uneven purchase in the mysteriously yielding road surface, and I could hear the suspension groaning under stresses it was never designed to handle. The strangest aspect of this entire experience was how the pavement appeared to return to normal in my side mirrors. When I glanced back at the sections of highway I had just traversed, everything looked perfectly ordinary. The tire tracks that I knew must be there, the evidence of my truck's passage through what felt like semi-solid ground, were invisible in the red glow of my taillights. It was as if the road was capable of healing itself, erasing all proof of its temporary transformation the moment I moved beyond any given section. Mile marker after mile marker passed, with agonizing slowness, as my truck continued to fight its way through this impossible terrain. The fuel gauge showed consumption rates that would have been appropriate for climbing a steep mountain grade, but the highway remained as flat as a tabletop, stretching endlessly toward the horizon under a canopy of stars that seemed unusually bright and close. The engine temperature began climbing toward the red zone as the cooling system worked overtime, and I found myself constantly adjusting the climate controls to maintain a reasonable temperature in the cab. Other vehicles began appearing in my mirrors, their headlights swaying and bobbing as they encountered the same incomprehensible road condition. A convoy of 3 trucks traveling together had spread out into single file, each driver maintaining extra following distance as they navigated the treacherous surface. I could see their headlights dipping and rising in patterns that defied the apparent flatness of the highway, creating a hypnotic light show that seemed to pulse in rhythm with the strange vibrations coming through my steering wheel. The CB chatter grew more intense as more drivers found themselves trapped on this section of highway that seemed determined to swallow their vehicles. Some reported that their trailers were sitting so low that the rear doors were nearly dragging on the pavement, while others described a floating sensation, as if their rigs were somehow suspended in thick liquid rather than rolling on solid ground. One driver claimed that when he stopped to check his tires, they appeared to be sitting normally on regular asphalt, but the moment he climbed back into his cab and resumed driving, the sinking sensation returned with renewed intensity. The radio traffic revealed a growing consensus that this phenomenon extended for nearly 20 miles along Highway 287, creating a gauntlet that had to be endured rather than avoided. The nearest alternate route would have added 6 hours to everyone's schedule, and several drivers reported that they were already running close to their mandatory rest periods. We were committed to this course, regardless of how impossible it seemed. As I fought to maintain control of my increasingly unresponsive truck, I began to notice that the sinking sensation was not uniform across the width of the highway. The right wheel of my tractor seemed to be encountering firmer ground, while the left wheel sank deeper with each revolution. This imbalance created a subtle but persistent pull toward the left side of the road, requiring constant steering corrections to maintain my position in the right-hand lane. The trailer began to drift and sway as its tandem axles encountered their own variations in the mysterious road surface, creating a snake-like motion that made the entire rig feel unstable and unpredictable. Just when I thought the situation could not become more surreal, I noticed that the yellow center line of the highway was beginning to glow with a faint phosphorescence that had nothing to do with my headlight. The painted stripe seemed to pulse with its own internal light, creating a beacon that guided us forward through the increasingly treacherous conditions. The white lane markers on either side of my truck developed the same eerie luminescence, as if the road itself was trying to help us navigate safely through whatever force was causing the pavement to behave like thick liquid. The end of this nightmarish stretch of highway came as suddenly as it had begun. One moment my truck was struggling through what felt like invisible quicksand, the engine laboring and the steering wheel fighting my grip, and the next moment we were rolling smoothly on normal asphalt again. The transition was so abrupt that I actually felt my stomach lurch as the truck suddenly accelerated under the same throttle pressure that had barely maintained forward momentum just seconds before. I pulled into the next truck stop, my hands shaking slightly as I downshifted and applied the air brake. The parking lot was already filled with other drivers who had experienced the same impossible journey, and small groups had formed around the fuel pumps and in the restaurant, everyone talking in the animated voices of people who needed to share an experience that defied rational explanation. When I climbed down from my cab to inspect my tires, expecting to find them caked with some unknown substance or showing unusual wear patterns, they looked exactly as they had when I started my trip that morning. The tread was clean, the sidewalls undamaged, and there was no evidence whatsoever that they had spent the last hour sinking into pavement that should have been solid. Even the tire pressure readings were normal, showing no signs of the stress that both my truck and I had endured. But here's the thing that still keeps me awake some nights, staring at the ceiling of whatever truck stop or motel I happen to be staying. The mirror at mile marker 47. From Jake Morrison. The CB radio had been crackling with static for the better part of an hour when I first heard mention of the sundown rest area at mile marker 47. I was hauling a load of frozen goods from Denver to Phoenix, and the desert highway stretched endlessly before my Peterbilt like a black ribbon under the star-heavy sky. The engine hummed its familiar lullaby, a deep rumble that had become as comforting as a heartbeat over my 15 years on the road. But something about that night felt different, the way the darkness seemed to press closer against my windshield, and how the usual chatter on the radio kept dissolving into an unsettling silence. I'd been driving for 9 hours straight, and my bladder was making demands that couldn't be ignored much longer. The digital clock on my dashboard read 2:47 a.m. in pale green numbers, and I knew I'd pushed my luck about as far as it would go. The next truck stop wasn't for another 60 miles, but according to the road signs, this sundown rest area was coming up fast. I'd driven this route dozens of times over the years, yet somehow I couldn't recall ever stopping at this particular facility. Maybe it was new, or maybe exhaustion was playing tricks with my memory the way it sometimes did during these long night hauls. As I downshifted and guided my rig onto the off-ramp, I noticed how unusually quiet the CB had become. Even the distant truck stops that usually chattered through the night had gone silent, leaving only the soft hiss of static and the steady thrum of my diesel engine. The rest area sat in a shallow valley, surrounded by scrub brush and scattered Joshua trees that looked like twisted sentinels in the darkness. The parking area was larger than I'd expected, with spaces for maybe 20 rigs, though mine was the only truck in sight. A single sodium vapor light buzzed overhead, casting everything in an amber glow that made the shadows dance and writhe with each flicker. The restroom facility sat at the far end of the lot, a low concrete building that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 70s. Something about its design felt wrong, though I couldn't put my finger on exactly what bothered me. Maybe it was how the windows were placed too high, or how the entrance seemed to yawn open like a mouth in the dim light. I set my air brakes with their familiar hiss and grabbed my flashlight from the door pocket, though the overhead light seemed adequate for the short walk. The desert air hit me as I climbed down from the cab, carrying with it the scent of sage and something else, something slightly metallic that reminded me of old Penny. My boots crunched on the gravel as I made my way toward the restroom, and I found myself moving slower than usual, as if my body was reluctant to complete this simple task. The concrete building felt even stranger up close, its walls stained with decades of desert weather and what looked like rust streaks running down from the flat roof. The men's room door stood slightly ajar, held open by a rubber wedge that had seen better days. Inside, fluorescent tubes flickered irregularly, casting an unsteady light that made everything appear to shift and move. The smell hit me immediately, not the expected odor of industrial disinfectant and neglect, but something sharper, more clinical, like the air in a hospital corridor. 3 urinals lined the left wall, their porcelain yellowed with age, while 2 stall doors stood opposite them. But it was the mirror above the sink that drew my attention and held it with an almost magnetic pull. The glass was old, probably original to the building, and it had that slight waviness that comes with decades of temperature changes. As I approached one of the urinals, I caught my reflection in that mirror, and something about it made me pause. I looked tired, more tired than I felt, with dark circles under my eyes, and a pallor that seemed unnatural under the harsh fluorescent lighting. But there was something else, something in my reflection that didn't quite match my movement. When I turned my head slightly to the right, my reflection seemed to lag just a fraction of a second behind, as if the mirror was showing me an echo rather than a true image. I told myself it was just the poor lighting and my own exhaustion playing tricks on my mind, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was fundamentally wrong with that piece of glass. As I finished my business and moved to the sink, I tried to avoid looking directly into the mirror, focusing instead on my hands as I worked the soap dispenser and turned on the faucet. The water ran rust-colored for several seconds before clearing, and the sound it made hitting the porcelain basin seemed unnaturally loud in the confined space. But peripheral vision is a tricky thing, and despite my efforts not to look, I kept catching glimpses of my reflection, and each time it seemed slightly more unsettling than the last. Finally, I forced myself to look directly into the mirror as I reached for the paper towel dispenser, and what I saw there made my blood turn to ice in my veins. My reflection was washing its hands just as I was, matching my movements perfectly now, but its face was wrong. The skin had a grayish pallor that spoke of death, and the eyes, my eyes in that reflection, were wide with terror and pain. More disturbing still, there was something around my reflection's neck, a dark line that looked like rope or cable, though I could see nothing in the real world that corresponded to it. I stumbled backward from the sink, my heart hammering against my ribs like a caged bird, but I couldn't tear my gaze away from that terrible mirror. My reflection continued to stand at the sink even though I had moved several feet away, and now it was looking directly out at me with those terrified eyes. Its mouth was moving, trying to form words that I couldn't hear, and its hands were clawing at whatever was around its neck with increasing desperation. In those brief moments of darkness between flashes, I could swear I heard sounds coming from the mirror, muffled gasps and choking noises that made my skin crawl with primal fear. When the lights stabilized for a moment, I saw my reflection clearly, and it was no longer standing at the sink. Instead, it was hanging from something I couldn't see, its feet dangling several inches off the restroom floor, its face turning purple as whatever was around its neck tightened inexorably. I wanted to run, every instinct screaming at me to flee from this impossible horror, but I found myself frozen in place, watching my own death play out in that cursed piece of glass. My reflection's struggles were growing weaker, its movements more spasmodic, and I realized with dawning horror that I could feel a pressure building around my own neck, a tightness that seemed to correspond with what I was witnessing in the mirror. That's when I noticed the sound from outside, the low rumble of a diesel engine that wasn't my own. Through the high windows of the restroom, I could see headlights sweeping across the parking lot, and the beam of light that briefly illuminated the interior revealed something that made my heart skip several beats. In that moment of normal illumination, the mirror showed only an empty restroom, no reflection of me at all, as if I had already ceased to exist. With tremendous effort, I tore my gaze away from the mirror and stumbled toward the door, my vision beginning to tunnel, as whatever force was affecting me grew stronger. Behind me I could hear the mirror creaking and groaning, as if it were under tremendous strain, and the sound of something heavy swinging back and forth with metronomic precision. I burst through the restroom door and into the desert night, gulping the sage-scented air like a drowning man breaching the surface of a lake. The pressure around my neck faded instantly, and I could breathe freely again, though my heart continued to race like a runaway engine. The truck I'd heard was parked several spaces away from my own rig, a newer Kenworth with Montana plates, and I could see the silhouette of its driver walking toward the restroom with casual, unhurried steps. I wanted to warn him, to shout some kind of caution about the mirror and what I'd seen there, but the words died in my throat as he passed under the sodium vapor light. It was my face looking back at me, exactly my face, down to the scar on my chin from a childhood accident, and the slightly crooked nose I'd broken in a bar fight 20 years ago. He looked at me with mild curiosity, as if I were nothing more than another traveler on this lonely highway, and nodded politely before disappearing through the restroom door.